Recall your earliest childhood memory. How old are you in this memory? 4, maybe 5? Developmental neuroscience tells us we do not form episodic memories before the age of 3. Supposedly, memories from before this time are merely phantoms, errors in the brain's memory formation process, ordinary daydreams mislabeled as fact. This is what the current research tells us. It's important you know this. Bear with me, listener. I won't waste your time with endless foreplay. Here's my story. I'm a graduate student studying linguistics. My work often overlaps with that of the neuroscience department, and I have made many contacts there. One such contact is the subject of this story. We'll call him DV. DV is also a graduate student. He studies memory. He uses a procedure called transcranial magnetic stimulation. This procedure uses magnetic radiation to activate targeted portions of the brain. Imagine a magic wand you can point at a cluster of neurons and say, "Dance," and they dance. 2 months ago, DV asked me to assist him in a pet project he was developing. He has assisted me in the past when I was learning to use an EEG for my research. I owed him a great deal. I had no choice but to help him in his work. DV is what I have instead of friends. I arrived at his lab after hours as requested. He was waiting by the door. He was wearing his lab coat. It was far too big for his frame and swallowed his shoulders. He looked so childlike. "Are you ready?" he asked. He had not told me any details about his project. "I just need practicing focusing the machine," he said. "I'm targeting an area of the brain no one has targeted with this device before." I consented. With a little hesitation, he had happily served as my model subject when I was learning the EEG. Academia is built upon exchange of favors. Besides, his machine doesn't even break the skin. I made myself comfortable in his examination chair. It had leather wrist restraints, but they were never used. I was facing a bay window. The lab was high on the campus hill. The night loomed heavy over the orange city lights. A few cars floated along the highway. "Now just try to relax," DV said. His breath was minty, with undercurrents of gin. He turned on the magic wand, and I felt the familiar buzz of electricity on my scalp. The vibrations converged on points just behind my ears, on both sides of my head. The points began to burn. My hair stood on end. "How do you feel?" DV asked. He was whispering, but his voice was thick with anticipation. I think he already knew the answer to his question. Before I could respond, I heard a cry from down the hall. Someone was screaming in the stairwell. Someone was howling like an animal shot through the leg. I heard flesh cracking, heard tendons popping. I heard a voice choking on words. Someone was vomiting up my name in the stairwell. "I think I need to take a break," I said. I tried to turn to look at DV, but felt hands holding my head in place. I tried to move my hands, but found the wrist straps had been fastened. "How long have I been here?" I asked. No one responded. The moaning down the hall grew closer. Someone was pounding on the doors. They were locked, but the door to the lab wasn't. "Please, turn it off," I said. The current from the machine felt like lightning coursing behind my eyes. The window grew larger. The cars on the road skidded out of control. I watched headlights careen into each other. The city lights blinked out, one by one. The darkness on the landscape was so thick, I could wade into it. So I did. I was out there, in the void. There was more distance before me than the Earth's horizon provides. I was alone, for a precious instant. Then, the darkness was broken by a man. He was the man from the hall. He was a man without skin, muscles and sinew all twitching, veins and arteries all spurting. I could see his heart shrivel in his chest when he looked at me. He was all slaughterhouse, no humanity. He was so close. I could smell the rotten meat on his silver bones. "Do you remember me?" he said. His teeth were gripped out like a racehorse. His frame was blurry, as if dislodged in time. His mouth looked like a slow exposure photo of a burning carcass. "Yes," I said, because I did. When I was young, too young to form memories, I had a dream. In this dream, a man walked behind me and told me things about the universe I didn't want to know. He was a man without skin. He was the man standing before me in the void. He followed me through the movie theaters, through city parks, through howling tunnels and unkempt forests and childhood homes, only to find me huddled in the corner of my bedroom closet. He spoke a few words. I don't have words for the things he said. I woke up soon after, drenched in freezing sweat, lips burned with vomit, eyes sore from rolling in their sockets. My mind tried to reject the memory. I have searched every language for the words I heard that night, but no tongue of man has ever spoke the things I heard. They're in the void. They're in the lab. The man had found me again. The machine fractured my defense, and I let him in. For the second time, he spoke those words, and for the second time, my mind refused to keep them. At some point, what seemed like an eternity later, DV removed the device from my head. As sudden as waking from a dream, I came to my senses. "How long was I hooked up for?" I asked. "Less than a minute," DV responded. He had lost his tone of knowing. His voice was quiet and trembled as he spoke. "Untie me," I said. I then realized my wrists were not bound. DV was frozen in the corner. I stood up and gathered my belongings. My ears were ringing, each in different pitch. They were dissonant. They were the last notes of a song I hadn't heard in 20 years. "I'm not coming back," I said. "Please don't contact me." DV nodded. His skin was as white as his lab coat. I walked the 5 miles to my home. I didn't trust myself behind the wheel of a car. The night was silent as I walked. Even the crickets were quiet for me. When I got home, I vomited into the bathroom sink. I watched my breakfast, lunch, and dinner circle the sputtering drain. I looked into the mirror. My shirt was drenched in blood, except for a pattern of ribs across the front. My blood was still wet to the touch. My pockets were full of cartilage. My socks were soaked in afterbirth. I threw my clothes in the trash compactor that night. DV and I do not speak. I do not see him on campus. I complete my schoolwork regularly. I pay my rent on time. I fall asleep to talk shows on weeknights and to whiskey on weekends. I don't do too much dreaming nowadays. I especially don't think about my childhood. Somewhere, in the unfathomable recess of inaccessible memory, there are words that shouldn't be heard. A man without skin chose to tell me those words, and I choose twice now not to remember them. At the beginning of this text, I asked you to recall your first memory. I hope it was from when you were 4 or 5. I hope it was a simple memory of your first injury or something similar. I hope these things, because somewhere in your brain, there is a memory of something your developed brain chose not to remember. I hope these things, because the infinite horror of those forgotten words is too great for the human mind to comprehend. I hope your dreams are blissful and your nightmares leave you happy to be awake. Most of all, I hope that this story keeps you from exploring those damning and boundless vaults of your mind. When we are born, we have no defense against the world, physical or mental. Perhaps it takes a few years to build these defenses. Perhaps the things we see before then are better left forgotten. My mom used to say that the rain is God's tears, and that's why we shouldn't drink it. She said a lot of things to make me behave. She told me that eating too many sweets make invisible goblins that chew on my teeth, that spiders would crawl into my mouth if I didn't breathe through my nose, that eating snow would freeze my stomach and turn me into a snowman. 100 little lies, all engineered to trick me into behaving. And I behaved. As the years passed, I've turned into a perfectly tricked human. I left all childish nonsense behind years ago. I pay my taxes and keep my head down. I don't eat too many sweets. I breathe through my nose. And I don't eat snow. And of course, I don't drink from the rain. Last August, I was at a supermarket on the outskirts of town. Just another lazy Saturday morning, with a sky full of gray clouds and a persistent wind. I'd bought some groceries and was heading for the door when I noticed it had started raining. I hadn't brought an umbrella, so I just pulled my leather jacket close and rushed to my car, hoping the bread wouldn't get soggy. I threw the groceries into the passenger seat, leaned back, and noticed a woman standing in the middle of the parking lot. She was staring straight up, with her jaws wide open, her mouth filling up with rainwater, like a bird bath. Seeing her, I couldn't help but think about what my mom used to tell me, to never drink the rainwater, that it was an ugly thing to do. My mom passed on years ago, but some words can stay forever. I sat there looking at her for a while. She had this black pixie haircut and a gray hoodie long enough to reach her knees. She was completely drenched, with lines of black mascara running from her eyes. It took me a while to notice she didn't have any shoes on. I got the feeling that maybe she just wasn't well. This wasn't something sane people did. Sane people don't drink rainwater like that. God's tears. It wasn't unusual that strange characters came by this supermarket. There was a prison nearby, and a lot of people stopped by to buy something on their way out, mostly friends and family visiting. But every now and then, there was an odd bird. I have no idea what kind of people they keep at that prison, but the company that runs it, they have quite a reputation around here. Hatchet is a strange company. I decided to say something and stepped out of the car. "Hey," I called out. "You're gonna get sick out there." She didn't flinch. It was as if she didn't even register my words as a language. Instead, she kept staring into the sky. She had this sort of mindless determination about her, like she didn't know what else to do. She didn't even blink. Raindrops bounced off her unblinking eyes. I was about to get back in my car, but I felt bad for her. She was barely an adult, and she was clearly having some sort of breakdown. I jogged back inside the supermarket. There was an older man standing behind the counter, listening to the radio. I'd shopped there a few times, but never actually talked to him. He didn't even look at me when I came back inside. "Excuse me?" I said. "I think the girl outside needs help." He leaned over a bit in his chair, squinting at the glass doors. She was still out there. "What for?" he asked. "I don't know. She's just standing there, and she doesn't have any shoes on." The old man was clearly not happy about this. Not about her standing there in particular, but that I'd bothered him about it. "Let's go," he said. "People don't talk to each other no more." I followed him outside as we approached the girl. The rain was picking up. "Hey," he called out to her. "You all right?" No response. He slowed his pace, giving me a concerned look. Now he saw what I saw. "You want us to call someone? You got a phone?" he asked. "Do you need any help?" We all just stood there for a few seconds, until the old man sighed. He put his hand on her shoulder, rustling her gently. "I'm sorry, but you can't stay here," he said. "You gotta move on." He shook her harder. making some of the water in her mouth spill over. I got a bad feeling. "Come on now." He grabbed her again, and she immediately lost her balance. She tipped over like a falling tree, her head smacking haplessly against the concrete. Water spilled out of her mouth, mixing with the blood from the fresh head wound. The old man's eyes went wild. He fell to his knees, repeating, "Oh my God," over and over. I backed away with my hand on my phone. I didn't register what was happening, and I went into a sort of paralysis. It took me a few seconds to notice she was still coughing up water. A lot of water, and some of it had turned black. I thought it might be blood, but it didn't look like it. It was way too dark. I was suddenly aware of the phone in my hand, the weight and texture of it. I dialed 911 as the old man put her on her side. "Breathe through your nose," he said. "Stay calm and breathe through your nose." Black water was pouring out of her like a faucet. Her eyes were still fixed on the sky. It felt like minutes, but it was just seconds. Breaths. The water stopped pouring out of her. She just laid there, unmoving. I could hear an operator talking to me in my ear, but it was as if the words just passed through me. I couldn't hear them over my own pulse. Something about an emergency, a question. She's not breathing," the old man cried. "She's not." A twitch. Her mouth moved. Something passed between her lips. Something dark. A finger? A claw? She rolled onto her back with a violent muscle spasm. She bent her back like an arch, balancing her entire body on the soles of her feet and the scalp of her head. She inhaled, sucking in as much rainwater as she could in a screeching gasp, her throat rattling as the raindrops passed into her lungs. We went from trying to help her to just staring in disbelief. In an impossible move, she got to her feet, invisible tethers pulling her back up, her face still locked toward the sky, and jaws once again wide open. Her body turned to me and the old man, and as we recoiled, she gurgled and charged us. My phone slipped out of my wet hands as she burst forward. I tripped over my own feet, falling backwards, and she hurled herself over the old man. Her head was constantly looking upwards, like a gyroscope. It was as if her body was moving and twisting independently from her head. I could swear she twisted her neck an entire 360 degrees at one point. I crawled backwards, scraping the palm of my hands. She gurgled again, the water from her mouth pouring over the old man that she pinned. He was gasping for air, spitting and coughing, wildly flailing his arms. Just this relentless stream of water, practically drowning him. Then he stopped. Slowly, he opened his mouth wide, and he too started to drink the rain. I stumbled to my feet and ran for my car. I could hear naked feet slapping against the concrete. She was chasing me. I got my keys out, unlocked the door, and got into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut right on her fingers, breaking them like carrot sticks as the door bounced back open. I crawled into the passenger seat as useless fingers brushed against my face, trying to grasp me. She crawled in after me, gurgling with anticipation. I got out on the other side of the car, slamming the passenger side door shut. I rounded back to the driver's side and closed that door as well, trapping her inside. She didn't have the mental capacity to open the doors, so she just settled back into pounding on the glass with her bleeding broken fingers. Her eyes were moving independently of one another, trying to find a way out, trying to find the sky. I backed away, my heart pounding. I didn't even notice my tears in the rain, just the sting of sweat in my eye. I kept hunching over, clutching at my stomach. It was burning, like my insides were trying to jump out of me. My heart was having none of this. The old man had gotten to his feet. He looked at me from across the parking lot for a few seconds. I could see the fear in his face, pleading eyes, begging for help. Then, his face snapped upwards, and he opened his mouth wide. His body, moving seemingly on its own, started walking towards me. He tripped over the concrete outlines of the parking spaces, barely keeping his balance. His shoulders smacked into a sign, sending him reeling onto the ground, all the while keeping his head fixed on the sky. Then, just as the girl before him, I could see this invisible force pulling him back onto his feet. Transparent tethers, hidden in the drops of rain. He got his bearings, and suddenly, he was fast. The man was easily 70 years old, but he was keeping an impossible pace. I didn't know where to go, didn't know what to do. He gained on me, and I just stood there like a deer frozen in headlights, thumping feet coming closer. Then the girl trapped in my car slapped her hand against the window again. The sound kicked me off like a starting pistol. I shot into a sprint as my stomach shivered. I don't remember running back into the store. I don't remember knocking over a stack of shopping baskets. It was just a blur of colorful packaging as I ran through the aisles. Cheerful radio tunes playing overhead. The old man tripped over a shopping basket and fell, sprawling to the floor, water spilling out of him like a fountain. As he struggled to get back onto his feet, I saw little things moving between his lips, like fingertips, black like ink. A little hand reaching out. He stepped back outside and leaned his head back upwards. Slowly, he walked out of sight, towards another side of the store. I was left standing there, holding a mop. I didn't even realize I'd grabbed it. I started to look for a phone. There had to be some sort of alarm, but I couldn't find it. There was no big red button to press. My hands were shaking, and I kept knocking things over. A bunch of pens rattled against the ceramic tiles. I looked for the manager's office. The guy was old. Chances are there was a landline. Going into the back, I heard a surprised yell. There was someone outside the back exit. I couldn't be bothered. I had to call for help. Help yourself before you help others. Put on the oxygen mask. The manager's office was locked. I tried just pulling the door open or banging at the glass slit, but nothing seemed to work. Finally, I pulled a fire extinguisher from the wall and just hammered relentlessly until the thing shattered. I put my hand through, clicked the lock, and stepped inside. The place was a mess, but it had a landline buried under piles of unsorted documents. There was a computer, but the thing was already old 10 years ago. I dialed 911 as I closed and locked the door behind me. I only have a vague recollection of speaking to the operator. I told her about people turning violent, but trying to explain it, I realized I sounded completely mad. I tried calming myself down and explained it in a way that made it seem like the owner had snapped. They asked me if I was safe, if he was armed, if someone was injured. 1,000 things it seemed like. I kept hearing little noises in the back of the store, and I completely lost my train of thought. "Sir? Sir, are you there?" I heard the voice on the phone, but it was distant. Every bone in my body was listening to what was happening outside. Someone was getting in through the back door. It was clunky, but I could hear the handle rattling. "Sir?" I slowly put the phone away. Not hanging up, just putting it away. I had to concentrate. There was an old toolbox in the corner of the room, so I grabbed a large wrench to defend myself. I needed solid metal in my hands. It brought me a kind of courage I didn't know I had. When the old man stepped up to the manager's office, I was ready. I slammed the door open, knocking him back. Even now, his head was tilted upwards. I whacked him over the head with the wrench, sluggishly connecting with his throat. He stumbled sidewards, and I hit him again. He tripped, fell over, and snapped his neck against the wall. It was over in a second. He stopped moving as black water oozed out of him, and there, moving at the edge of his lips, were little black fingers reaching outwards, desperately, looking for something to grab, to pull itself free. His jaw moved up and down, like he was chewing on an invisible meal. His eyes were still fixed upward. As I raised the wrench to attack again, the little hand stopped moving. It turned into a black sludge, like coagulating darkness. I couldn't let go of that wrench even if I wanted to. My fingers had cramped shut. I took a deep gasp. As I realized I'd been holding my breath, I backed away. I'd killed this man. Self-defense or not, he was dead. No question about it. "Sir? Sir!" I could hear coming from the landline in the other room. I didn't know how to explain this. I didn't know what I'd say. I just stood there, listening to myself breathe. In an instant, the world shifted upside down. I lost my balance as something grabbed me from behind. I fell hard on my right shoulder, losing the grip on my wrench in the impact. Two arms had gripped me and was pulling me backwards. The stock boy. He'd been out back on a smoke break this whole time. That's the startled sound I'd heard. He'd been attacked. Moments later, I felt the rain again. He dragged me outside. The guy was in his early 30s and built like a redwood. He had no trouble keeping me off balance. As he pushed me to the ground, he tilted his head downward as water started to spill. "Wait!" I screamed. "Wait! Wait!" Then, rainwater. Lukewarm, body-temperatured rainwater. It's hard to explain the sensation. At first, I was drowning, trying to keep water out of my lungs. But after one or two involuntary gulps, I didn't feel it anymore. It was as if the air and water switched places. The rainwater kept me alive, and losing it would mean choking to death. My neck locked itself staring upwards, as to not lose any water. As I looked up at the clouds, I heard a voice. It felt like it was reaching into my stomach, resonating in my body like an echo. Rain falling on me, making it look like I was running through a tunnel, or being pulled upwards. Hello. A greeting. A dark presence went swimming through my thoughts, little tendrils seeping into my memories, touching all my secrets. I could feel my body moving on its own, and all I could do was look up. I tried to scream for help, but all I did was gurgle. It hurt something awful, burning like razor wire being pulled out of me the more I resisted. There was something up there, something in the clouds that needed me, the way a body needs a pair of hands. I lived in that world. I don't know for how long, having a conversation with something inside myself, trying to feel something. My body was numb and distant, frozen solid and pulled by an impossible force. And at some point, the rain stopped. I was staring up into the sky, coughing up water, as my body slowly remembered how to breathe. I was lying on my back, looking up at the clouds. They were parting. I turned to my side, feeling something wriggle in my throat. I gulped down hard, feeling an obstruction slide down. Then the water started coming out of me. Rainwater, black water, and blood. I had no idea where I was, but it took me some time to orient myself. It was a grassy field, just a bit out of town. Underbrush, some scattered trees, and a few dried up discolored sunflowers. I was just off the freeway, about a 15-minute walk from the store. I'd seen this field on my way home from work, I realized, not too far from Frog Lake. I eventually made my way back to the supermarket. 4 patrol vehicles and an ambulance had arrived, sirens wailing. I saw the young woman with black hair being lifted into an ambulance, her hand broken and bleeding. She had a tight bandage wrapped around her head. They were also moving a body out of the store, and 3 officers were talking to themselves and taking pictures by the entrance. Coughing up the last drops of black water, I tried my best to scream for help. All that came out was a gurgle that slowly turned into a scream. That part was all me. They eventually recognized my voice from the emergency call. They took me in, had a medic check me out, and question me all about it. The officers tried to piece it all together into something comprehensible, ending up at a story of an old man goes crazy and gets killed. I wanted to tell them more, but I just couldn't find the words to make it sensible. There was some surveillance footage, but it didn't cover much of the parking lot. All they saw was me being chased into the store by a sick-looking man before I was sent home and asked not to leave the state. I got the chance to ask my own question. I asked them about the young woman in my car and what happened to her. Apparently, she'd been picked up by her guardians almost immediately. They had all the paperwork in order, as well as a pair of very expensive lawyers. Strange people, the officer noted. Didn't seem very parental. Since then, I've been getting shivers whenever it rains. I get this sense that I should go outside to see if there is anything up there, something that still needs me, something calling to me. But I'm fine, according to the doctors. Still, I don't trust myself to stay inside. I lock myself in the bathroom with my headphones on, waiting for it all to pass. I've read about others seeing her, a young woman who comes out when it rains to drink from the sky. I have to know more about her. I need to know what happened to me. So, if you've seen her, please let me know where and when. And if you meet her, just walk the other way. My mother left us when I was 6 years old. She'd been having an affair with a coworker, and it turned into a relationship. My dad got full custody of me, and this huge part of our lives just disappeared, seemingly overnight. A year later, my mother had moved to Sarasota and was about to have her second kid, what would be my half-brother, Charles. My father never really recovered. He tried to get back out there, but some levels of trust just can't be regained. Still, time passes. 2 halves of my family repaired themselves, and even though my relationship with my mother never quite recovered, we kept in touch. A periphery touch, but still, if something were to happen, I got to hear about it. And then there was Charles, my half-brother. I didn't know him, and everything about his very existence had always been painted in sort of a black cloud. I hated him not for who he was, but for what he was, an expression of the most turbulent time in my youth. I hated him. I couldn't help it, and I knew nothing of him, but I hated him nonetheless. I didn't pay much attention to Charles and his antics. He was just this person somewhere off in the distance, living his own life. I saw the occasional high school photo, or him recommending something off his Spotify playlist. He was just some guy. I wasn't there to celebrate any of his big birthdays, and he didn't celebrate any of mine. Charles turned 21 in 2017. I saw some pictures of a big party, and there was an open-ended invitation for anyone to come join. I'm sure I'd have been allowed to, if I wanted, but that was never really on the agenda. It wasn't even discussed. I had my own life at that point, and patching that bridge seemed useless, like trying to fix something that you've worked your whole life to get around. What's the point in fixing a bridge when you're an Olympic swimmer? Something like that. But there were things happening behind the scenes that I didn't know of until much later. For example, Charles had been having anxiety issues since middle school. He was riddled with phobias and panic attacks. He'd been having trouble keeping up in school, and most of his friends were at best superficial, the kind of people who turn their backs on you when the going gets tough. I had no idea about any of that, but I was about to get a lot more involved in his life than I'd ever asked for. It was late July in 2018. I was coming home from a long shift and happened to stop and get some groceries when my phone went off. I loaded in the last paper bag, gave my girlfriend an apologetic look, and took the call. It was my mother. I hadn't spoken directly to her for decades. "Hey, Blue Jay," she sighed. "I'm sorry it's been so long." My first reaction was anger. How dare she call me that still? It turned my stomach sour, like I'd swallowed something smoldering. I managed to keep things polite, biting my lip. "Everything all right?" She had to be calling for a reason. She wanted something. She'd never talked to me without a reason. "It's about your brother," she said. "I don't know what to do." "I don't have a brother." "But you do," she sighed. "You do, and I think he needs you." She explained the situation as best she could. As a way to deal with his issues, Charles had been seeking advice and guidance from people outside his usual social circles. Harmless stuff at first. Spiritual guides and faith healers. He'd studied Buddhism and Hinduism to broaden his horizons, and he'd been trying everything from yoga to revival gatherings. But lately, things had taken a turn. "It's just been one thing after another," my mom explained. "And now it's just, he's gone all quiet." "Isn't that a good thing?" "Charles tells me everything," she sighed. "This isn't like him. I can't get a hold of him." "So just call the police then." "He's an adult now. There was a short break. She composed herself, clearly upset. My callous tone wasn't helping. "I think he's with some bad people." She reached out to me, figuring I'd be someone far enough in the periphery to go under the radar. Someone they wouldn't question too much. Everyone else in Charles' life seemed to be blacklisted and turned away at the door. But perhaps an unknown half-brother might slip in. That's what she argued anyway. "I know I can't ask you to help," she said, "but I think it could do us some good. All of us." "Family's important to you, huh?" Again, silence. I just shook my head. I'd opened the car door and sat down. My girlfriend could tell I was upset and was leaning over to hug me. I hadn't even noticed how hard I was digging my fingers into the dashboard until I saw them turning pale. "You don't have to believe me," Mom said, "but it is. It really is." And with that, I hung up. I argued with myself back and forth for days. Charles had never done anything to hurt me, but I couldn't help but to hate him. But it was difficult to say whether that hate was more important than that sinking feeling I had in my stomach. Even then, even at my lowest, angriest point, I couldn't bring myself to want to hurt my mother. I couldn't. So I decided to help. All things be damned. At the very least, I could show her I'd turned into a good man. All without her help. I texted her to get me all the info she could, and I booked a flight over the following week. I made my way to Florida. I'd been getting tons of emails with all kinds of images, descriptions, and videos, but I hadn't taken the time to sit down and review it all. I had a rough idea. According to my mom, it all started with a nightmare. She told me that Charles kept having nightmares about a boy in blue. He'd call her late at night, rambling about it in a half-woken stupor. These nightmares would control his life, and he would try to find subtle ways of dealing with it. To an outsider, It just seemed like much of his other anxieties, a fixed idea that he couldn't rid himself of. There were pictures of his apartment. He'd removed the curtains from his windows to make sure the boy in blue could spot him, if need be. Later, he would just opt to sleep out in the open. Something about the clear blue sky being a relaxing factor. And there were other things. He started to wear more formal shirts. He cut his hair. He started growing strange flowers in his front yard. And then, radio silence. Gone. First thing I did was check his apartment. Just like my mom had said, there were no curtains. I could see straight in, and it was easy to tell it hadn't been used for quite some time. I got the impression that something had happened here. It was just too barren. A 20-something-year-old with an interest in religion and philosophy, and not a single piece of memorabilia, no books, nothing. The place was a ghost town. Hell, at least the sunflowers he'd planted were doing well. Not a fan of the blue color though. Those things didn't look natural. The final straw was seeing a pile of mail by the front door. It was substantial. We were talking a couple of months at least. Reminders on reminders. Then, there was the core issue. The group he was involved with. The Church of the 12th Sky Assembly. They had a bit of a social media presence, but they didn't have much to say. They seemed like your average run-of-the-mill group, with smiling young people offering companionship and understanding in their outreach material. It was so general that I felt like I'd seen it before. I had a bit of luck though. Turns out they had a community event going on later that day. I figured it was a good way to get my foot in the door. Probably wasn't the best idea to just go knocking on their compound. From what I could find, they had a place out by Lake Parish, but it seemed to be a members-only kind of deal. Not much said about it in their socials. So I drove out to Bradenton Beach, hoping to spot these nut jobs in action. Turns out, it wasn't as difficult as I imagined. They'd made themselves a bit of a stand down by the beach where they were handing out flyers. Looking at it from a distance, you might mistake it for an energy drink promo. About a dozen beach-fit young people eagerly engaging in conversation. It seemed so disingenuous. Still, I gave it a shot. I put my sandals on and took a casual stroll, pretending to be passing by. It didn't take long for a young man and woman to come up to me, their smiles as wide as the flyers they were handing out. "Excuse me," they smiled. "Having a nice day?" "Can't complain," I smiled right back. "You folks out here selling something?" "Nah," they chuckled. "Just sharing the good vibes." And with that, I had a pamphlet in my hand. I stuck around to talk to them for a bit. As a whole, the organization didn't look that strange, but once you started singling out individual pieces, you could see some inconsistencies. For example, their logo. For a church called the 12th Sky Assembly, one might imagine clouds or a cross, but no. Their logo was a wheelbarrow, one of those old-timey wooden ones. I counted the pegs on the wheel, but it just added up to 7. It wasn't even numerically consistent. Then, there were the members themselves. I got the impression that this wasn't an actual passion of theirs. They seemed disconnected, and their lines seemed practiced. Like they weren't really members of the church, but just paid to be there. The way they talked when they didn't think anyone was listening sort of confirmed this. This was all an act. But for what? "Are you folks out by up by Lake Parish?" I asked. "I think I've seen that logo before." "That's just administrative. We're in 7 different cities across the state, so it takes a whole lot of effort from a whole lot of people to keep things running." They immediately got defensive. I tried to shift away from the compound, instead talking about meetings and other members, but they'd already soured. It wasn't until one of the folks in the background approached that I felt like I was getting somewhere. The man was in his early 50s, with short blonde hair and a sizable gut, large black glasses, a white shirt, and a blue tie. He patted the others on the shoulder and smiled at me. "You consider yourself a man of many questions, friend?" he asked. "I suppose I am. Not a lot of places to ask them nowadays." "Well, I hope you find what you're looking for." And with that, he turned his back to me. I must have said something to spook them. I had no choice but to go all in. "The boy in blue," I said. It was the first thing that came to my mind. It had been the central theme in Charles's issues. It had to mean something. The man turned around, adjusted his glasses, and squinted at me. "The boy in blue, huh?" "Yeah," I nodded. "It's been keeping me up at night." "I can imagine." He put his hand on my shoulder and took a deep breath. Finally, his eyes met mine. This time, his smile was genuine. "Perhaps we got a few things to talk about after all." I spent the better part of my day talking to that man. His name was Isaiah, and he was one of the aspiring members of the church. He'd been with them for a couple of months and was still getting his bearings. Still, what I'd said resonated with him. The boy in blue was a common theme among the church's inner circle. They said it was a prophetic vision, a guideline for things to come. Later that afternoon, as we were calling it a day, Isaiah and I circled back to the tent they'd set up down at the beach. I almost stumbled over one of the wheelbarrows they had there, and I couldn't help but ask about it. "It's an unusual symbol. I'll freely admit to that," Isaiah chuckled. "But it's about picking yourself up, about extending yourself beyond your own capabilities. That's a lot to ask from a wheelbarrow." "We don't ask anything from the wheelbarrow," he smiled. "It's about you. You're the one who has to pick it up. But it's there when you need it." Having a foot in the door, I settled into a temporary routine. I called my girlfriend every night, keeping her updated on what was going on. I sent a text to my mom every now and then too, but I couldn't bring myself to talk to her. I would spend my afternoon messaging Isaiah and trying to keep a low profile, waiting for an invitation to something further. If I could just get the chance to meet the other members, there'd be a chance of meeting up with Charles. And maybe I wouldn't be able to get him out of there, but at least I could make sure he was okay. I met Isaiah a couple of times over the following week, once for lunch, and another time at a separate event. I was invited to help, and I accepted. I mostly printed pamphlets and helped setting up their tent. The pamphlet wasn't that interesting. The logo, an address for an office downtown, and an inspirational quote about reaching for the sky. Not much more than that. I got the impression that handing them out was mostly a way to get an excuse to talk to people, rather than share a message, almost as if it was expected for them to do this. The more I spent time with Isaiah, I got the impression that this wasn't just a church. There were no priests or preachers, and there were no spectacular meetings. If anything, they were just going through the motions. Everything pointed to the compound by Lake Parrish. There had to be something there, and Isaiah was my way in. I had to try something big. The third time I met him, I hadn't showered for 3 days. I pretended to have slept in my car, and I made up a little lie about going through a rough breakup. Isaiah was a bit surprised, but bounced back as the gears in the back of his mind clicked into place. "Sorry to hear that," he said. "You made a beautiful couple." It was an innocent enough sentiment, but there was an uncomfortable reveal hidden in it. He knew what my girlfriend looked like. I'd never shown him a picture. Had they been looking me up? "I guess that's why you're out here, huh? Starting over?" "I'm just in a bad place," I said. "I barely get enough sleep as it is." "No, I hear you," he nodded. "I've been there, but it's like sometimes the cure is worse than the disease, you know?" Him saying that stood out to me. This wasn't a man trying to trick me into a cult. This was a man trying to keep me out. It was a warning, not an invitation. "Anything is better than this," I sighed. Isaiah looked me in the eye, clearly concerned. He tapped a nearby wheelbarrow. All right then. We drove out to Lake Parrish later that day. It was a silent trip with Isaiah behind the wheel. No radio, no small talk. If anything, he seemed apologetic, like he didn't want me to do this. Following a side road, we passed a sign that reminded us that we were entering private property. Not long after, we reached a chain-linked fence. Isaiah had a key for the padlock. The compound was not what I expected. A trio of one-story buildings out in a field, covered from end to end by the fences and trees. The knee-length grass that covered the area made the place look abandoned. A handful of people in white shirts moved behind the buildings, pointing at one another and having a lively discussion. So what can I expect? I asked. Do all the people here have the same problem? Yeah, Isaiah nodded. But not all are willing to deal with it. He looked up at me, but not in the eye. He wasn't sure about this. Talk to Miss Miller, he continued, and go from there. I got some time to just walk around the compound, looking for Charles. There was a central area between the three buildings that looked like a sort of gathering spot. The ground was flattened and the grass cut. The 6 wheelbarrows off to the side. I don't know why, but I felt this unease looking at them. They all had these dark splotches at the end. There were probably about a dozen people there at the time. Isaiah took the car and left, leaving me to speak with this Miller woman on my own. She had an office on the west end of the front building, almost like a reception. I couldn't get over how sparsely decorated the place was. A logo every now and then, the occasional wheelbarrow, and that was it. The place was pretty much sterile. It even smelled like a hospital. Miss Miller was an older woman, with short gray hair and thick glasses. She asked me to come in and sit down across from her and fill out a form. I was asked to surrender my phone, keys, and wallet. The form asked for all kinds of personal info, including passwords and usernames for various social media accounts. But what surprised me the most was the second page, which was all about my proposed anxiety issues. There were 3 spaces for paragraphs, where I was supposed to describe my meetings with the boy in blue. I just made something up, trying to keep the small talk up. Miller didn't have much to say. She assured me that there was help to get, but that they needed complete honesty from me. I tried to ask her about the other members, which she called patients, and how they were dealing with it, to which she had this to say. What you're experiencing is no fault of your own, she said. It is not by the will of God or Satan or anything in between. It is beyond our measure, and so, the steps to stop it seemed drastic. I had to go through a quick physical checkup. I had to fill out a health form, and they tested my blood. There was a surprising amount of people on hand who seemed to have a medical background. Some seemed to have a corporate background. I noticed a lot of boxes with a particular pharmaceutical company. Looked like a sort of axe or hatchet, when all things looked to be in order. I was guided to a personal room at the far end of the compound, a long corridor with locked rooms, from which I could hear groaning and crying. A nurse ran past me with an armful of bloody linens. Miss Miller showed me to a private room. Not much to it. A bathroom, a bed, an end table. No windows. And the door locked from the outside. The latter I didn't notice until the door clicked closed. I probably spent the better part of a day locked in that room. I could hear people in the other rooms. Most of them weren't saying anything coherent. Some were crying, others just screamed. Some tried to keep their composure and politely ask for help, all coming from muffled voices behind locked doors. Now, I don't have a way to check, but I think it took about 12 hours or so in total. I'd arrived in the early morning, and by the time the door opened, it was getting dark outside. My first thought was to get the hell out of there, but I was in too deep. I'd invested too much, and I just had to finish it. If Charles was stuck in this place, it was time to get him out. When one of the nurses let me out, I was handed a wicker basket with various hygiene articles and some fresh clothes, washed and cleaned. I was put in a line with other people, some who looked worse for wear, others who didn't seem to know what was going on. There was this one woman who could barely stand up and had to lean on one of the nurses. Looking at them, it was easy to forget that this was supposed to be a religious organization. It looked more like a hospital. We were taken out in the middle of the compound. There were about a dozen attendants, and 9 other people like me who'd been taken out there. They turned on a series of floodlights, bathing the yard in a pale white. That's when I saw Charles. He must have lost at least 30 pounds. The guy was skin and bones. His hair had fallen out, and he had this patchy, unshaven mess on his face. He looked completely out of it. I couldn't imagine him recognizing me in even a healthy state. But now that I had seen him, I was glad I was there. I was going to help him, one way or another. I just had to get through whatever this was supposed to be. We all lined up in a circle, each with a wheelbarrow in front of us. Everyone else lifted them up by the handles, and one by one, they were administered a pill. People just took them. No questions asked. I could hear a single protest, someone not being sure. They were simply asked if they wanted help or not. They did, and the pill went down. When it was my turn, I just shook my head. "No, thank you." "Then we're gonna have to ask you to leave," said the nurse. I looked around the circle. I was holding up the line. There was no ifs, and, or buts here. If you wanted their help, you took the pill. So I did. It was a sort of muscle relaxant. It wasn't a powerful hallucinogenic or anything, just something that made my shoulders slump and my speech slur. But looking around the circle, it seemed to have a massive effect on the others. The nurses went patient to patient and recorded what they were saying, making notes on a spreadsheet when there was something of particular interest. Most folks were just rambling incoherently, but a few of them were strangely lucid. Some were naming places or things, vague descriptions of events unfolding. A few of the nurses were asking targeted questions, or even making demands. "Ask him to show you the Portuguese election," one nurse said. "Are you getting anything?" I was asked to share my experiences too. I just copied down a bit from what I heard others saying. I could tell they weren't entirely convinced. They went out of their way to get a light to shine on my face. But before they had the chance to, one of the guys next to me started freaking out. He was in his early 40s. Didn't look all that peculiar. Pretty fit, somewhat shorter than usual, balding, reading glasses with a crooked frame. His knuckles had gone white, and he started shaking his wheelbarrow. His eyes rolled back in his skull. "A fire!" he screamed. I see a fire." The nurses flocked to him. He's showing me a fire." Screams. "A highway cut off by falling trees. Late autumn. November." Crackling bark. Turning black. "Look for a license plate," one of the nurses said. "Can you see a license plate?" Ontario." One of them ran off, speaking loudly into a phone. Others stepped back. They all looked at the man with anticipation. He releases me," the man said. I'm released." And with that, there was a sudden quiet. The nurses looked away, as if bracing themselves. I didn't look away, but I wish I had. His voice became more distant and his jaw extended. His tongue was swelling. So was his abdomen. Seconds later, there was a loud pop. Blood and viscera exploded out of his stomach, filling the wheelbarrow. Then another pop, as his tongue did the same. Then, he just stood there, bleeding out, frozen, holding that wheelbarrow, a tool to keep him from staining the ground. No one reacted. No one recoiled or ran or screamed. It was just this eerie quiet. I could feel panic boiling in my chest, but I tried not to stick out. There was no telling what they'd do if they thought I was faking it. About half a minute later, it happened to another one. The nurses called out to one another, confirming what they'd heard. Fire, Ontario, late November. They were crisscross examining information and details given by these people. Every bone in my body was telling me to run, to just beeline to Charles, get him, and head for the exit. But looking at the dead man to my left, still standing, holding his wheelbarrow, there was a primal part of me that refused to move. I felt like an antelope watching a lion pass by. A twitch of the leg might set it off. I had to wait. They were poking and prodding at the others, asking them questions. 4 people in total. Seemed to have something to share. And the same 4 people popped like overly ripe berries. Their faces had a look of relief on them, like this was some kind of reward. This was what they aspired to get. The thought struck me that perhaps this is what awaited Charles as well. I looked at him as his head started to swivel back and forth. His eyes were rolling back. I couldn't wait. I took my first steps towards him. No one noticed at first, but as I gained speed, others called out. They asked me to stop, to wait, to listen. But as I saw Charles' hands tighten around the grip of the wheelbarrow, and his voice rising in cadence, I didn't consider the consequences. I had to try something, anything. So I tackled him, and the moment I put my hands on him, something inside me broke. I looked into his face as the world shifted. I was standing on a highway among dozens of broken down cars, burning trees falling all around us to the screams of hundreds. Charles was there. We were running in the wrong direction, watching people choke to death inside their cars. Others just walked into the woods, falling from asphyxiation. Further down the road, a child, a boy, no older than 7 or 8, dressed in blue. That's who we were heading for. Charles looked back at me. "He's showing us," he said. "We have to keep up." I grabbed him. I slammed him to the ground. I could feel the texture of the asphalt on my hands. I could taste the burning oak trees. But it wasn't real. And it couldn't be. In the blink of an eye, we were on a plane, falling from the sky. Oxygen masks, long since deployed. People screaming as alarms blared. Again, just down the aisle, a little boy in blue, waiting for us to come closer, wanting to show us more. "He's trying to save us," Charles cried. "He needs me to." "No." Another blink of the eye. Standing on a beach, watching a cruise ship slowly capsize. I forced myself to look away, to not see the name of it. I grabbed Charles by the face, forcing his eyes to lock onto mine. Blink after blink after blink. Earthquakes, shootings, fires, lightning strikes, hurricanes, floods, bursting dams, falling bridges, knives and guns, hangings to cheering crowds. Death, death, death. Then, for a brief moment, grass. Back in that field, in that compound, people were coming for us. Charles was next to me, clutching his stomach. I leaned over, grabbed him under his arms, and lifted him onto his feet. If I was gonna have to drag him out, I would. Blink. A congregation standing in a massive cathedral. As the ceiling caves in, idols and Latin hymns crumbling, dark shades in the distance growing closer, then back again, screaming all around me. Another patient has burst on the other side of the field, filling another wheelbarrow. Blink, blink, blink. Soon, the screaming was getting harder to tell apart, some of it coming from the nurses, others coming from the patients, others still coming from God knows where. It was all getting mixed up. Still, I carried Charles step by step, out towards the front fences, trying my best not to have him look at anything for too long. His stomach was moving. Literally, physically moving. His eyes were rolling back and forth. His tongue swelled to the point where words turned to noises. I had to get him away from this, to distract him. Something. I closed my eyes. A hot wave of air, stinking of sulfur. An endless highway. Waves of red sand blasting us from all sides, blistering our skin. Rattling bones litter the side of the road, bearing witness to countless people who have fallen. Off in the distance, a boy in blue, urging me to look closer, to get sucked in. Just like the rest of them, I cover my eyes as well as Charles. You need to know. A voice whispers right next to my ear. You need to see. Something is pressed into my hand. I protest. I scream. I feel the sand burrowing into my skin. Suddenly, I'm sitting down. A soft wind. The click of a seatbelt. Then sudden acceleration. I thought it another vision, but it lasted too long. Hold on! A gate crashing open. I was in the backseat of a car, with Charles next to me. He was doubled over, crying hysterically. In the front seat was Isaiah, stepping on the gas. I'm sorry, he gasped as he turned the car around, heading for the highway. This is the only way to stop it. It's the only way it ends. And with that, we sped into the night. By morning, Charles was getting better. His stomach wasn't moving anymore, and his tongue wasn't swelling. His eyes were red, but he could focus again. He was barely speaking, but visibly conscious. He responded to questions, albeit non-verbally. Isaiah confided in me that he'd been plagued by the same visions as Charles for some time, but couldn't bring himself to go all the way. He'd seen the end goal, and how the nurses poked and prodded for people to extend themselves. That's not the way I want to go, he sighed. No matter what, that's not it. He shared a cigarette with me. I hadn't smoked since high school. I saw what you were trying to do, he admitted. You were making the same choice that I'd had, except you were showing it, you know? You were doing something. I've just been coasting along. Isaiah told me all he knew. The church was sponsored by some kind of pharmaceutical company, that the religious front was basically a way to identify legitimate targets and bring them in, to turn them into this sort of commodity, a wheelbarrow man, someone who could share something about things to come, for a company to exploit. They're not telling you the whole story, Isaiah continued. They don't tell you that it passes, that it comes and goes in waves, leaping from one person to another, and that if you just refuse to listen hard enough, it'll leave you alone. So they offer you a fast and easy way, at the cost of your life. Yeah, Isaiah nodded. Story as old as time. He looked down at his cigarette with a sigh, flicking it away. Charles was slowly recovering. He could barely speak, and we had to help him in and out of the car. But he made it back home. I thought I'd be angry seeing my mom again, but there was no way to get angry at a smile that honest. Her sense of relief was infectious. And that time, when she hugged me and called me her Blue Jay, I couldn't help but feel like she meant it. That one time at the very least. And that was that. I kept in touch with them over the years. Charles was in and out of therapy, slowly recovering from his painful visions. He got back on his feet about the time when the COVID pandemic hit. Isaiah got completely out of the Church of the 12th Sky Assembly, instead getting involved in local politics in his home state of Indiana. I think he worked some kind of local campaign there. I'd like to say I've grown closer with my mother's side of the family, but that's not really how the world works. This was an anomaly, in many senses of the word. I'm sure they're thankful, but apart from the occasional greeting or birthday card, things are as they've always been. So in a way, things are as they will always have been. And in another very real sense, nothing is. See, something was pressed into my hand that night. I haven't told anyone about it, and I probably never will. A note with names, dates, and events. I don't want to think about it too much, or I might fall victim to the same thing that Charles did. Even talking about it now, something brings this sinking feeling into the pit of my stomach. Still, I can't deny that I recognize some of these names in the news, and it's making me nervous. But it raises an important question. Would the knowledge we gain from this be worth a life? Could it save others? Is it even real? The fire reference that night never happened, as far as I know. But if I hadn't spoken about it, could it have happened? I think one way to get a clear answer is to look just a bit closer and put it all on the line. I had the strangest thought the other day while sitting alone in my bedroom. Could a sane man drive himself to insanity with enough effort? Can I regulate my environment and mind in such a way that I reach the point of not being able to control my mind? I had some spare time and an overactive imagination, so why not try? To do this, I just set up my environment in the right way. I can't communicate with anyone face to face or electronically. I told my parents and brother I was going away on a hiking trip and possibly wouldn't have service, so they wouldn't suspect a thing. Check. I'm going to isolate myself and stay in my bedroom, and only leave when absolutely necessary. I won't be leaving my house. Check. After. Be constantly aware of my thoughts, or as constant as I can muster. Ask myself why I'm doing everything I'm doing. Why am I having the thoughts that come into my head? Am I in control of them? Check. Don't stop questioning. Check. Think about it intentionally. There will be a small, why am I here? Am I actually in control or is this predestined? You know, thoughts like that. Check. I'm going to try and sleep regularly. I won't be keeping track of the time, and I do not have a window to gauge daylight. I don't want to know how much time is passing. Check. Last but not least, complete isolation from activities. No phone, computer, books, anything. I'll be entirely alone with my thoughts. Every night I'll write in my journal on how the process is going, but that'll be it. Day 1. This is much more boring than I expected. I've paced around my room a little over 320 times today. I didn't start counting until about the 5th time around. I only have one dim lamp in my room on my nightstand next to my bed. My room is so bare, nothing on the walls. I have a dresser facing my bed with 10 handles, 5 drawers made of wood, and 6 feet tall. Not literal 12-inch feet, but 6 of my feet tall. I've been counting a lot and measuring things in my room out of boredom. I have 56 wooden floorboards in this room. Yeah, it's also very quiet. I'm not used to it being this quiet. It's almost sickening. It's causing a ring in my ears, so I hum to myself just to hear anything. But that god-awful roaring silence, it's something else. Day 2. It might be day 3. My internal clock has told me I've been awake for about 20 hours, slept for maybe 5, then been awake for another 20. I can't be sure though. I've started to deal with the silence by talking to myself. And I'm not crazy just talking to myself or anything. I know I'm in control of it. I just do it to pass the time and make sure I don't forget what my voice sounds like. I'll make up scenarios in my head and say them out loud. It feels like rehearsing for my middle school play. I wish I had carpet in my room. Day 3. Maybe. I started to question if I'm dreaming. Because I've started dreaming about this room. And only this room. It seems like I hadn't left in weeks. If I stare at my plain, off-white wall long enough, I begin to see static all across it. Is that normal? I feel like that happened before, but now I'm just hyper aware of it. My new greatest pleasure is going to the bathroom. It feels like I'm treating myself. I have one connected to my room. It's like a little vacation. I wish I had a shower though. I'm starting to smell a little bit. I'm not too sure. I don't like this. I suppose that was the point. but I truly believe I'm breaking. I was convinced that the police showed up at my house today. I heard sirens in the distance from my bed as they grew louder and closer. They stopped. I put my ear to the door and listened carefully. Bang! It sounded like they broke down my fucking front door. I couldn't decide whether to scream at them or hide. But screaming would go against the rules of the experiment. The police wouldn't just break into my house like that. What if I imagined the sirens, but the door breaking in was real? I quickly flew under my bed and lifted up a loose floorboard that I used to hide weed in back when I was in high school. I squirmed my way in and placed the board back in its spot. I guess it's a good thing I don't have carpet after all. I swear I could hear them walking around my room, sometimes slow, sometimes sprinting. I still reeked, and was afraid they'd smell my BO and find me. Then I had a peculiar thought. If I imagined the sirens, I could have imagined any of this, the footsteps included, right? I mean, I had been hearing faint voices and sounds of background music earlier that day, and I knew that wasn't real. It was probably from sleep deprivation. I had no reason to hide from the imaginary sounds. I climbed out, looked around, and no one was there. Jesus Christ, maybe I am going insane. I'm not entirely sure what day it is, but I think it's day 3. No, maybe 5. I've lost it. I have. Maybe it's relentlessness, or maybe it's sleep deprivation. Maybe it's the lack of sunlight, or maybe it's me being unable to keep track of time. But I've had enough of this shit. I'll do it for one more day. I thought about ending things today. Last day, I woke up from a dream that someone was breaking into my house. I was just sitting in my bed, minding my thoughts when I heard the door bash in again. I heard a stampede of souls rush straight to my room. The handle of the door jiggled, and the banging commenced. It was my parents and brother. They were beating on my door, asking where I had been and why I wasn't answering their calls. They said it had been months since I last spoke to them. This time, I knew I was dreaming. I knew it hadn't been months. I've been locked in this room for maybe a week at most. My internal clock was fucked. My facial hair couldn't lie. I told them to leave me alone and began to cry. They're the first souls I've spoken to since I locked myself in this room. Even if it was just a dream. I woke up, looked at my hands to reassure myself I was awake, but I wasn't even 100% certain I was out of my dream. I was crying in my dreams and started to cry when I woke up. I was sweating. I decided today was the day I ended it. Not myself, but the experiment. I opened my bedroom door for the first time since starting the experiment. I walked into my living room to see a complete disheveled room, but my phone was still intact where I left it. Did someone actually break into my house? Or did I sleepwalk and do this unknowingly? I checked my phone. I had a few missed calls, but from no one important. I walked outside, took a huge breath of fresh air. God, it felt good not to breathe in musty air. I stretched my arms and enjoyed the late morning sun for the first time in 9 days. According to my phone, it's only one more day than I can tell my family I was out camping. I treated myself the rest of the day. Shower, social media, TV, a walk in the park, and shopping. On the way back home, I got pulled over by a police officer. I knew I had been speeding. I was more curious than fearful. A tall, sunglasses-wielding man with 5 o'clock shadow walked to my already rolled down window. He cleared his throat. "Carter Miller?" He knew my name. "Yes, Officer Graham." I read off his badge. "Can you please step out of the car?" "And what's this about, officer?" "You're a suspect in the disappearance of your mother, father, and brother." I was stunned. My heart raced. "Oh God, officer. I just got back from a camping trip yesterday, and I haven't been able to contact them since. I was on my way to the station right now to file a missing persons report." I had worry threaded through every word of my sentence. "I just went to their houses and they weren't there. Do you He cut me off sternly. He bluntly asked, "Where did you go camping, and when?" I pulled out 2 plane tickets from my glove compartment. One was on a flight from Atlanta to a small airport in Colorado, and the other was a return ticket. I handed them to him. He sighed and asked me if I could come to the station for questioning. "Of course, anything I can do to help. I'll be there at 4 p.m. sharp." It took me 5 minutes to get back to my parents' house, where I'd been staying for the past week, in my old bedroom. It took another 15 minutes to move the minimal furniture in my room. I rolled out the shag carpet over the old floorboards. Now, the decay leaking from underneath. It looked good. It only took about 10 minutes to build up enough believable tears and arrive at the police station. I couldn't stop thinking about that beautiful carpet in my room, though. I don't think the police suspect me. I bought real plane tickets after all. I had rehearsed my lines enough over the past week to be beyond believable. I guess you can't drive yourself insane. Just guilty. It was the first Saturday of October, and my boyfriend and I found ourselves at the entrance to Twilight Creek Farm's amazing corn maze. It was around 4 p.m., and the sun had begun to dip towards the horizon. The air had that crisp autumn chill, hinting at a cold night. A cardboard cutout stood at the entrance of a cartoony ear of corn, grinning wildly. Yes, it was clear that the intended demographic for this maze was about 2 decades younger than us. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Tyler asked. "Come on, it'll be fun," I replied, grabbing a map from the anthropomorphized corn. Then I linked my arm with his, and the 2 of us walked into the maze. The corn rose up all around us, about 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Our feet sunk slightly into the muddy ground. In retrospect, it probably wasn't a great idea to go corn mazing after such a heavy rain, but whatever. We were here now. The corn quickly swallowed us up. Within a minute, I could no longer see the entrance, just corn stretching in every direction, a dense forest, choking out all else. As we rounded the bend, the path ended in a T. There was a metal sign, eroded at the edges, planted firmly into the muddy soil, featuring the cartoon corn again. Remember these steps to ensure a fun time at our amazing corn maze. First, shh, don't tell secrets in the maze. The corn has ears. Second, don't stay in the maze after dark. Third, if you're under 13 years old, stay with your parents or caregiver at all times, please. And finally, remember, there are no mirrors in the corn maze. At the bottom of the sign, there were 2 arrows, and it read, "Left, easy kids maze, estimated 20 minutes. Right, challenging maze, estimated 1 hour. "Can we just do the kids maze?" Tyler asked. "It's kinda cold." "Yeah, but it's so lame," I replied, looking over the map. "It's like literally a straight line." He sighed. "Fine." So we turned right, following the path into the corn. Our footsteps squelched softly in the mud. "So no mirrors in the corn maze?" I asked, trying to start conversation. "What do you think that's supposed to mean?" He shrugged. "Maybe they want to make it clear it's not like one of those haunted funhouse things. Like if you see a path, it's real and not a reflection. I guess." As we walked down the path, an awkward silence fell over us. Okay, I'll admit it. I had an ulterior motive for this trip. Tyler and I had been fighting off and on all week. Just little things here and there, snipping at each other. It was like something in the air had changed between us. Little things were annoying me and him constantly. Maybe it was the shorter days, the lack of sunlight getting to us. Maybe, at most year of dating, we were finally coming out of the honeymoon phase. Whatever it was, I felt like a change of scenery would do us some good. Of course, I was starting to regret that now. With the chill creeping into the air and the mud sticking to my sneakers, we probably should have just postponed it to next weekend, when it wasn't after a heavy rain. But I felt like I couldn't take one more minute in that apartment. Which way now? Tyler's voice jerked me out of my thoughts. I looked up. Ahead of us, the path split into 3, each path considerably narrower than the one we were on. I looked down at the map, but I didn't see any places where the path split into 3. I don't know. He raised his eyebrow at me. We're lost already? I looked down at the map, scanning the schematic. The cartoon ear of corn smiled up at me from the paper, and I wanted to punch it in the face. I don't see any places where it splits in 3, I said, handing him the map. He said, looking over it. Maybe that's part of the challenge. The map is wrong. That would be kind of interesting. Don't they say if you want to get out of a maze, stick to one side? Like keep your hand touching one wall. He stretched his arm out and touched the corn on the right. Yeah. I followed him down the rightmost path. It suddenly seemed darker. Probably because the path was only about half the width of the previous one, and we were deep in the shadows of the corn. Dry leaves brushed against my arms, feeling more like rough claws raking against my skin. I felt the cold of the mud permeating through my shoes with each step. We passed an intersection, and for a split second, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw someone walking in the other direction, but when I turned my head, nothing was there. I thought I started to Tyler, then I shook my head. Never mind. Probably just my hair falling into my line of vision. Still, I was starting to really not like this. We made another right and another, following the wall, but we didn't find an exit. More layers of mud caked onto my shoes. I was so tired. Maybe we should just turn around and go home, I called out behind him. He turned around, his eyes lighting up. Really? Yeah, should be easy enough to backtrack. We can just follow our footprints. Sounds good to me, he replied. We turned around and began to follow our footprints back. But 15 or 20 minutes later, we still hadn't found the entrance. We haven't been here that long. We should be out by now. Are you sure we came this way? I called out as I followed Tyler down the sharp right turn I didn't remember taking. Has to be, he replied, gesturing to our footprints. But when we turned the corner, we found not one set of our prints, but 2. We were going in circles. This is ridiculous, Tyler huffed. Maybe we should call someone. I pulled out my phone, and my heart dropped. It was 5:23 p.m., over an hour since we'd entered the maze. What is it? Tyler asked, seeing my face drop. I held up my phone. We haven't been here this long, have we? He paused for a second, then shook his head. We have to follow our footprints out. We'll get out eventually, and if we're really lost, we can dial 911 or something. Okay, so which way? I asked. One set of footprints went down each path. Left. We were making all rights before, so it should be lefts to get out. We veered left. The corn seemed to squeeze in on us, the path growing more narrow with each step, like the field of corn was some kind of monster, ready to engulf us at any second. I shook my head and continued forward. There's nothing wrong here. We're just lost in a challenging maze. That's all. But when the path widened, I realized how wrong I was. We were standing in a clearing about the size of my kitchen. There was a sign, the same battered thin metal as before. In the middle, I froze as I began to read. There are 2 ways out of this maze. You can either find the way out on your own, or you can choose to leave behind one person in your party and the exit will make itself known to you. Either way, make sure you're out of the maze by nightfall, because then, nobody makes it out. The cartoon corn man was painted on the bottom of the sign, grinning up at us. This time, there was a bit of rust or red paint around his mouth. I couldn't tell if it was intentional or not. My heart began to pound. I felt like I couldn't get enough air in my lungs, like a panic attack was about to start. Tyler burst into laughter behind me. "What? They're trying so hard to make it like a scary ARG or something," he said, laughing. "It's so lame." I whipped around, arms crossed. You don't actually believe it, do you? All I know is we've been walking around this maze for an hour, but it's only felt like 20 minutes. And the map doesn't match the maze. And I don't remember parts of the maze that we've clearly been to, because our footprints are there," I said, all in one breath. I stared at him, panting, my heart pounding in my chest. "Kate, I'm sorry. You're really scared, huh?" "And so are you. I saw how scared you looked when you realized we were going in circles, but now you're just going to pass it off and pretend it's all a game?" "Kate, I want to get out of here," I shouted. "Whatever this is, game or not, I hate it and I want to go home." Tyler put his hands up defensively. "Whoa, okay, I'm sorry. Let's keep going left. We'll get out, I promise." Huffing, I cut in front of him and veered down the left path, leading the way. My shoes squelched loudly. The path narrowed again, corn clawing at my shoulders and hips. We curved left and right, and then, to my relief, the path opened wider in front of us. We're out. The hope leaked out of me like a deflating balloon. The path did open up into a much larger area, a clearing, like the last one, but I hadn't remembered seeing the clearing, despite the footsteps trailing all over it. Our footsteps, crisscrossing, frantic, some clearly made by us running. The depressions in the mud deep and smudged. I turned around. No, Tyler wasn't behind me. My legs went weak underneath me. "Tyler!" I shouted. The path curved behind me, disappearing into the darkness. No sign of Tyler. I scanned the corn surrounding the clearing, but it was dark and shadowy and infinite, stretching in every direction. "Tyler?" The corn rustled, somewhere to my left. I glanced over, but I couldn't see anything. The corn was too dense, the shadows too dark. The sky was darkening now, threatening dusk. It was clearly pitch black in the shadows of the cornfield. I stared at the mess of footprints on the ground. What the hell is going on? I pulled out my phone and called Tyler. It rang several times, then voicemail picked up. Fuck! I called him a second time, and a third. He didn't pick up. For a while, I just stood there, calling his name. The sky deepened to dark blue above me. The corn rustled in the breeze, stretching in every direction. Birds soared to their nest, chirping. Then chittering of bats overhead filled the silence. There were two paths at either end of the clearing, one curving left, one curving right. Now, they were pitch black, like looking into the deepest of forests, choking out every last bit of light. I turned on my phone's flashlight and swept it down the entrance of each, but nothing appeared to be there, just stalks and stalks of corn, all lines and shadows overlapping each other. And then, finally, I heard something. Somewhere, down the left path, from just out of my view, I heard a soft whimpering sound. Tyler? A rough whisper. Kate? I approached the path, my heart pounding in my ears. I held the phone out in front of me, lighting up the path. Tyler? I whispered, and then I saw the blood, the patch of wet and dark mingling with mud. I swept the flashlight over the corn. The beam of light fell on a bloody hand, lying in the mud, just a few feet within the corn. I jerked the flashlight back, revealing an arm, and then Tyler's face. He was so pale. His eyes were wide, his cheeks were smeared with blood. Kate, he groaned, a horrible gurgling sound mingling with his voice. I'm coming to get you out of there. I tried to force my way through the corn, but it was impossible. They were planted only 6 inches, maybe a foot apart. I didn't have the strength to bend or snap them. "Tyler, what happened?" He didn't get the chance to tell me. I watched in horror as his body began to slide backwards through the corn, as if something was dragging him. "Tyler!" I screamed. The sound of corn stalks snapping filled the air. I frantically shone my flashlight into the corn, sweeping it in every direction. But all I saw was more and more corn everywhere, filling up every square inch of space. I ran back through the clearing, back down one of the paths, pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "My boyfriend and I are in a corn maze, and he's hurt. I think there might be someone out here, and—" "Slow down, please," the woman said. "You said you're in a corn maze?" Her tone sounded skeptical. "Yeah." "Where?" "Twilight Creek Farms." A beat of silence. "Do you know what the punishment is for calling emergency services when there's no emergency?" she asked, her voice sharp. "What?" "Prank calls can put you in jail for a year. Did you know that?" I stared at the corn, my throat closing. "What? This isn't a prank call. My boyfriend is really hurt. I think someone—" "Ma'am," she cut me off. "Twilight Creek Farms has been closed for 3 months now, ever since the bodies were found." All the air sucked out of my lungs. "But bodies?" I croaked. "We've gotten over 24 calls since then, claiming that someone's in trouble," she replied, condescendingly. "But the entire farm was razed, since they lost all their money in the wrongful death suit. So what kind of game are you trying to play?" I trailed off. Three months? Uh-huh. What month is it?" A scoff. "January?" The phone fell from my hands. This can't be real. I must be dreaming. I wheeled around, the white of my phone's flashlight sweeping over the corn. The path was curved away into darkness, deeper into the corn. I snatched my phone off the ground and walked back towards the clearing, but it wasn't there, like the corn had swallowed it up, grown in its place in the span of minutes. What the fuck is going on here? The sound of footsteps jerked me out of my daze. Squelch, getting louder, coming closer. Squelch. I turned the flashlight off and began running in a random direction. I took every left turn, keeping against the left wall of corn, praying I would find an exit. I tried calling 911 again and again, but no one ever picked up. They must have flagged my number as some sort of prank call. The farm has to have some safety system in place. They let kids come here. They have to search the maze before they close up for the night. They wouldn't just let people die here. I stopped to catch my breath. My lungs burned. I couldn't run anymore. I just couldn't. I stood halfway bent over in the middle of a narrow path, the corn impossibly close, sucking in lungful after lungful of icy air. "Kate?" Tyler's voice, incredibly quiet, barely a whisper, from somewhere in front of me. I began running blindly towards him. The path zigzagged left, then right, and then I saw him. Tyler was standing at the end of the path, facing away from me, his form illuminated in silver moonlight, the shadows of corn crisscrossing over his back. "Tyler?" I whispered. I ran towards him, but halfway there, I stopped. Something is wrong. He wasn't turning around to look at me, wasn't moving at all. "Tyler?" Nothing. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, hand shaking. I lifted up. No. It was wearing his clothes, but it wasn't him. It was a scarecrow. Hay poked out of the neckline of his shirt, out of the cuffs of his jeans. His hands were just bunches of hay, girdled with twine. Stray pieces of hay scattered the ground, falling out of his hiking boots. But wait, that didn't quite make sense, because he had hair. Undeniably his hair, wavy and black. The gears in my brain spun, trying to figure out what exactly was going on, trying to interpret this thing standing in front of me, stuffed with hay, with his clothes, his hair. And then I realized it. The body was a scarecrow, but the head was not. I could see Tyler's pale ears, the blood dripping onto the hay of his neck. I opened my mouth and screamed. The corn stalks rustled and snapped, shaking violently as something moved within them. And then it emerged. A scarecrow, moving in jerky, stilted movements towards me, holding a long silver blade dripping with blood, missing a head. I took off down the path. My feet pounded underneath me. My lungs burned. I tried to keep right because I'd been going left the other way. Did that even make sense? But everything blurred and smeared in my mind. All I saw was corn, endless rows of it, lit by moonlight, pitch black shadows underneath it, a silver moon hanging overhead, bats twirling and tilting through the air. After what felt like hours of running, I finally accepted my fate. I'm never getting out of here, and neither is Tyler. Somehow, I evaded the scarecrow all night. Before I knew it, the sun was rising. I thought I'd finally found salvation when I heard voices on the other side of the corn. But then I realized what they were saying. "Are you sure you want to do this? Come on, it'll be fun." It was our voices. I screamed until I was hoarse, telling them, us, to stay away. I screamed for help. I tried everything. I clawed my way through the corn, towards where I had heard them, because clearly they were at the entrance. But all I found was more and more corn. It was futile. At one point, I think I broke through just for an instant, but then I watched her shake her head and say, "Never mind. Time passes strangely here." With all our days in the cornfield overlapping each other, rows upon rows of our footprints crossed the dirt. From an eternity of running from the scarecrow, every time I try to stop Tyler from getting taken, and every time I fail. And then there's always the night. I spend every night evading the headless scarecrow. I know my own fate. I know it was bodies, not a body, that was found at the cornfield. I know I don't make it out alive, but I evade her anyway, hiding in the corn, deluding myself that if I stay long enough, maybe I will get out. I'm sure it's been more than 3 months now, but the moon rises all the same, hanging silver over the corn. The stalks rustle and snap. I hide in the corn, my breathing fast and heavy, praying that one day I will find a way out. And now I know that day will never come. They say that things change when you observe them. For example, my mom would look so proud at my childhood soccer games, but she'd immediately change the moment she noticed me on the substitute bench. A moment of observation, intended or not, can change everything. One summer, my parents drove me out to a nearby national park. They had a junior ranger club where kids were introduced to all manners of wildlife knowledge and survival trivia. I wasn't sure about it at first. It seemed like just another thing on a long list of nothings, but I gave it an honest shot, along with a dozen other kids, and the chemically positive ranger accompanying us. We had craft sessions, survival training, cave exploration, and all kinds of games. Unlike sports, it wasn't just about beating an opponent. This was about cooperation, to work together. Seeing us all work towards a common goal, it changed something in me, brought out something good. I enjoyed that. Back in July of 1998, all 12 junior rangers set out on a spotlight night walk. Along with our guide, we were to pack our own survival kit and make our way to one of the ranger stations. There, we'd unpack and be graded based on what we'd chosen to bring. There was this excitement in the air. It was like a graduation of sorts. We were to become official wildlife stewards, they called it. We excitedly paired up in a buddy system, 2 by 2, and followed the trail. It was supposed to be uneventful. The man in charge, Ranger Dan, had done that walk every summer for the past 12 years. He was prepared for a lot of things, but nature had other plans that night. I remember him holding up a hand, silently asking us to stop and listen. There was this deep groaning noise off somewhere in the dark. I heard rustling branches and crackling saplings. I saw 2 gleaming stones, reflecting the shine of our flashlights. A black bear. Looking back at it, it really wasn't as bad as it sounds. The bear sniffed at Ranger Dan for a bit and wandered off. But to a group of 10-year-olds, it was like staring at death itself. My buddy panicked and bolted into the woods. We're not allowed to ever leave our buddy, so I did my best to keep up with him. I yelled at him to stop, but by the time he did, we'd been separated from the rest of the group. I couldn't even see their flashlights anymore. Luckily, they used to have a system in place to help lost visitors navigate. They called it the Lady Bluebell system. All over the park, they'd wrap blue tape around the trees and tie a bell in the direction of the closest ranger station or trail. Even in the dark, you could hear a bell go off every now and then, and you could check the bell to get a direction. Spotting the blue tape immediately improved our odds of survival. We'd been taught that, if all else fails, all we have to do is follow 3 simple rules. Stop, listen, look. Lady Bluebell takes you home. Those were the rules. That first moment when I realized we were lost was terrifying. I could barely breathe. It was like choking on the darkness. My buddy was having a panic attack, but I did what I'd been told to do, to stop, listen, and look. Lady Bluebell would take me home, and I swear, not only did I hear that bell, I saw her, a tall woman in a blue dress, off in the distance, a sun-tanned arm pointing us in the direction of the trail, long dark hair framing a brilliant smile, a warming presence in the dark of the night. Maybe I remembered it wrong. Maybe she wasn't really there, but I think she was. My buddy and I were probably lost for no more than 20 minutes. We made our way back to the trail. Not long after that, we spotted flashlights in the distance. The rest of the night was nothing but praise from Ranger Dan, all the hot dogs we could eat, and scary stories told by a roaring fire. I never told anyone about seeing Lady Bluebell, not a living soul. My mom thought that night would be the end of my interest in the Junior Ranger Club, that it had scared me away, but strangely, it had the opposite effect. I had used what I'd learned to survive, to win. And this wasn't just winning at a game. This was winning at life itself. I'd faced fear, actual danger, and lived to tell the tale. That's when I knew I wanted to be a park ranger. I got my Bachelor of Science in Nature and Forest Resource Management from MSU, worked a few different jobs, took a sabbatical, and ended up with a position at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources in 2009. Nowadays, I'm the one running the Junior Ranger Club. Ranger Dan retired back in 2018, but still volunteers for the club in the summer. I've acquainted myself with the area for over a decade. I'm confident when I say that I know my way around. I know what animals roam which areas, and I can tell by the shifting seasons what is to come. I know how flash floods smell, and I can tell by the taste of the air when a lightning storm is coming. Still, every now and then, Mother Nature surprises me, and sometimes, she gives way to something different entirely. The park has changed a lot too. The Lady Bluebell program, for example. Over the years, it evolved into a sort of mascot. She was portrayed as this radiant woman in a blue summer dress. She also had her sidekicks, like the mischievous Ricky Raccoon and the ever somber Sunny the Sad Sunflower. There were comic books, trading cards, stamps, merchandise. She was a beloved icon. They hired a woman to dress like her every summer, to welcome the junior rangers and teach them the system. Lady Bluebell was sort of our Smokey the Bear, telling kids how to behave in the park and to keep themselves and others safe. I loved it. Long after the end of the Junior Ranger Club came to an end, I still collected all sorts of Lady Bluebell memorabilia, but there were issues. Over time, some visitors to the park began stealing the blue tape, keeping it as a souvenir. Others just took the bell. Some moved the bell around, purposefully pointing it in the wrong direction. Over time, the effort and resources required to constantly fix the system started to outweigh the benefits. They officially ditched the "Lady Bluebell Takes You Home" motto in 2008 and retired the mascot entirely in 2011. I was sad to see her go, but it made sense. It just wasn't practical anymore. Times change. Now that you know me a little better, I want to tell you about one particular incident. Something I just haven't been able to share with my friends and colleagues. It was late August. I was following our southeastern trail, mapping the movements of an elk herd. The leaves were just about to change color, and there was a tinge of cold in the air. Branches had started making snappier sounds, and the days were rapidly growing shorter. Autumn was just around the corner. That day, I was ready to head back when I spotted a plume of smoke just off my trail. Nothing big, possibly a campfire. I decided to give it a once-over, just in case. I came up on a small camp, a rough-looking one-man tent, neon orange, a hastily constructed campfire with what looked like a grilled squirrel. I caught a whiff of sweat coming off the tent, giving me the impression that whoever lived in there had been there for a while. Looking at their choice of meat, I figured maybe a bit too long. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone here?" I heard a shout in response and hurried footsteps. Someone falling, getting up, and then sprinting in my direction. At first I was taken aback, thinking it might be a wild animal. Seconds later, a young woman crawled into camp. The best word to describe her was disheveled. Her hair was a tangled mess, and she was deeply sunburnt on her arms and face. Her lips were dry and pale, and her hands kept shaking. The moment she saw me, her eyes welled up with tears. "Yes," she cried. "Jesus Christ, yes." She got up and flung her arms around me, crying onto my shoulder. Not just a sob either, but a full-on wail. She tried to say something, but every other word got stuck in her throat. Did I make it?" she sniffled. "Am I out?" I sat her down, offered her some water, and asked her to calmly explain what happened. "I just can't believe my luck," she said. "I thought it was all over." I choked on my words. Nothing had prepared me for this. We weren't out looking for anyone. We hadn't been for months, maybe years. "It's okay," I said. "Let's pack up. Let's get you home." Her name was Anya Baker. She'd been part of a company retreat and got lost somewhere along the way. She figured she'd been out on her own for about 2 weeks, but there was no way to tell for sure. "The days kinda blend," she sighed. "You keep walking, and it might have been an hour or 2 days. It messes with your head." She was malnourished and dehydrated. I didn't think she had the strength to make it back. The closest ranger station was quite a way off. I asked if I could help her carry something, but she brushed me off. "I got this," she insisted. "Please, just get me home." We got back on the trail and started making our way back. I took out my radio to call it in. "I used to come here all the time," Anya said. "Never thought I'd get lost." "It happens to the best of us," I smiled. "You made it. That's what counts." I thought I did it right. I stopped, I listened, and looked. Followed the bells. All of it. We don't do that anymore. I figured. I told Anya about how the Lady Bluebell program had been discontinued for over a decade. I complained about the sabotaged bells, the stolen tape, and all the stupid things that tourists had done over the years. Frankly, I found it strange she'd found any bells at all. I hadn't seen them for years, but there were more immediate concerns. I'd never had trouble with my radio before, and now it was dead as a doornail. I brought out my backup batteries, but the radio stayed silent. Still, Anya was in better shape than I'd anticipated, so I figured we'd make it back by nightfall if we kept a good pace. About 200 feet down the trail, something started to feel wrong. The trail should have turned by then, headed west. Instead, it kept going north. Looking around, I couldn't see any of the usual landmarks. We continued for another 10 minutes, only to see the trail suddenly stop, not slowly disappear into the moss, but stop altogether. There were no trails like that, not on that hike, not for as long as I'd been there. I wasn't taking any chances, and there was no point in dwelling on it. The radio was busted, so I picked up my flare gun. It was only one shot, so I had to make it count. I aimed it up, asked Anya to step back, and fired. The light soared into the sky with a swoosh, bathing the treetops in an intense red glow. Those things are louder than you think. It's nothing like the movies. Now we sit tight, I said. They can't find us if we keep moving, so we buddy up. Anya smiled. That's what you're supposed to do, right? That's right. I nodded. You're a junior ranger? Anya made herself comfortable on a log and took a swig from my canteen. Lady Bluebell takes you home, she sighed. She shook her head and handed me back the canteen. A twinkle in her eye came and went. Not anymore, it seems. We stayed out there for hours. We shared a protein bar, and Anya helped me set up a campfire. To my surprise, there was a stream nearby. There wasn't supposed to be, but there was. We'd boiled some water, refilled my canteen, and made ourselves comfortable. It could be hours before someone got to us. It didn't take long for the sky to turn black. I figured no one would find us in the dark, so we set up a camp. Anya had her tent, and I had a hammock. We both went to bed early, but I couldn't get any sleep. My new buddy was out cold though. I guess the excitement of seeing another person for the first time in weeks was enough to wear her out. I, on the other hand, was anxious about not finding my way back. It didn't make any sense. I'd walked that trail 1,000 times before, somewhere in the space between the waking world and an uneasy sleep. I remember thinking about Lady Bluebell. Her 3 rules were simple: stop, listen, look. First, to stop, so you don't get more lost than you already are. Second, to listen. The sound of the bells usually travels much further than the sight of the blue tape. And the third rule, to look, was a reminder to identify which way the bells were positioned. I remember thinking that we'd already done the first part. We'd stopped. As part of me wanted to listen, like I'd done back when I was a kid, to hear that bell and find my way back. As sleep faded from my mind, my eyes drifted into the dark. I noticed a strip of blue tape wrapped around a nearby tree. Strange that I hadn't seen it before. Maybe it wasn't there until I started to look for it. Anya was awake long before I was. She'd heated up a bag of chickpeas from my pack and sliced up some salami. Simple stuff, but all you needed to keep going. I went to refill the water canteen again, but couldn't find my way back to the stream. Realizing it just wasn't there anymore made my blood run cold. I wasn't used to doubting myself. I knew these woods like the back of my hand, and suddenly, it felt like I'd found an extra finger. None of these made any sense. I checked my map and double-checked my compass. There was nothing even close to a landmark in our vicinity. There were no obvious elevations, lakes, or rivers. I was running out of options. It took me a moment to realize that Anya was staring at me from across the campfire. Having picked up on my anxious fiddling, she gave me a reassuring smile. "I saw her once, you know," she said, "back when I was a junior." "It's not uncommon," I added. "Lots of kids think they see her." We all made her up in our minds, trying to convince one another that she was real. "No, I mean, really saw her. Dress and all. Tall as hell." Anya finished up her last spoonful of chickpeas. "I was fetching out firewood. I wasn't even lost. She just stood there, looking at me. Shadows can play tricks on us." "No, see, that's the thing," Anya laughed. "It was the middle of the day. We waited all day long. Morning, afternoon, and long into the night. Still, not a soul to be seen. No flares going up. No sounds in the distance. It was just me, Anya, and miles of forest. A forest that should be familiar to me, but somehow wasn't. We decided that come morning, we would make our way back on our own. Heading straight north should bring us to one of the main trails, no matter our approaching angle. I couldn't bring myself to tell Anya that I, too, had seen Lady Bluebell. After all these years, I still couldn't believe it, even though it had been just as clear as the way Anya had described it. That night, I stayed up listening to the howling wind. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I couldn't help but listen, and the more I tried to avoid it, the more I heard it. And there, hidden in the breeze, was something else. Distant bells, urging me to look for Lady Bluebell. The next day, we packed up and got moving. Anya was much better off than when I had first met her, having snacked on most of my backup rations. I had some left, but we'd have to start foraging soon. Still, the trail shouldn't be more than a few hours out at most. But then again, nothing seemed where it ought to be anymore. We hiked through a clearing, stepping over collapsed trees and knee-length grass. Then I spotted something in the distance. I waved Anya over, and we took a detour. It was one of our old stop, listen, look signs. I hadn't seen one in years. It was a bit roughed up, but still legible. However, it had been slightly altered. Someone had added "don't" to every line with a bright blue paint. Don't stop, don't listen, don't look. Lady Bluebell won't take you home. "Did you?" "No," Anya interrupted. That's new." We came to the same conclusion. We weren't alone out here. We continued north, but I couldn't help the feeling that there was something off about the whole area. I started to notice little details all around. Broken branches and paths in the grass. There was a spot next to a large rock that looked like someone had been sleeping next to it. The tracks were pretty distinct. I even found a few footprints, and Anya swore that she'd never been there before. By late afternoon, I was getting worried. Not only had there been more footprints and tracks, but they were getting fresher. We slowed our pace, and I started to take a better look around. I needed to get an estimate of just how many others were out there. I was following the tracks of about 3 people when I saw another clearing ahead of us. It took me a few moments to realize that we had, effectively, walked in a circle. We were back at square one. I couldn't even see the stop, listen, look sign in the distance. I brought out my compass, took Anya by the arm, and stormed off. We had to try again. I don't know when or where we got turned around, but I couldn't stop now. We kept going north. All this time I didn't put away my compass for a second. We settled in a steady jog, making sure the clearing stayed behind us. Anya kept a steady pace, even if she made a lot of noise. At one point, we stopped to drink some water. I looked back for a second, only to see something in the distance. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was standing upright. No, not just standing, running. At first, we didn't understand what we were looking at. It took me several seconds to realize it was even human. A young man, no older than 17, maybe 18, rough hair, with cuts all over his legs and arms. He was only wearing a pair of torn jeans, darkened by weeks of built-up dirt. He didn't run like people usually do. He was hunched over and flailing with his arms. He kept doing this strange motion with his neck, like a bobblehead, never standing still. As he got closer, I could hear this constant mumbling, not a scream or a whisper. It was like he was trying to maniacally force little words into every exhaled breath. I couldn't hear what he was saying. I only understood that it was repeating. Anya backed away, but it was clear that he was heading straight for us. That's when I noticed the sharpened flint in his hand. Before I realized what was about to happen, he charged us. He went for Anya first, but she was too quick for him. As she ducked behind a tree, I moved to intercept. I grabbed my camping shovel from the side of my backpack and took a swing. As our attacker turned to face me, my swing clocked him right across the side of his face. There was a deeper cut than I'd anticipated, severing parts of his ear. He reeled back and fell over. He struggled to regain his balance, but the head trauma made his eyes spin. His mouth kept opening and closing like a fish out of water, forming the same words over and over again. Don't stop. Don't listen. His eyes locked onto mine. His pupils widened as a shiver worked its way out into his voice. Shaking to his head, a tear escaped him. Don't look, he quivered. Don't look. His eyes flicked to something off my side, a piece of tape hanging off a broken tree. As I tried to assess his wound, he burst into movement, no longer able to run straight. He toppled over into a bent-over gallop, bracing himself against the tree and stumps as he fled in a panic. I heard branches snapping long after he was out of sight. Anya just stood there, frozen. I tried to put my hand on her shoulder, but she reflexively slapped it away. I could see she was on the verge of hyperventilating, barely holding still, barely holding on. Just give me please just give me a second, she said. Please. After that, we slowed down. I kept hearing noises in the distance, mumbling words and snapping twigs. And sometimes, when there was a sudden gust of wind, there'd be bells. Sometimes one, sometimes several. But we stayed on course, moving north. As night fell, I realized that I didn't want to stop. Whenever I stopped, the sound would get louder. The bells would get closer. Whatever lurked in the dark seemed to gain on us, even though nothing leapt out at us, and there were no more attacks. I had this constant sense of unease, like sleeping in gasoline right next to a wobbly candle. Anya wasn't faring much better. She sat next to our campfire for hours, slowly rocking back and forth. Sometimes I'd see her snapping her head in one direction or the other, as if reacting to a sudden noise that only she could hear. I twisted and turned for hours, barely keeping my eyes shut. It felt like the night would never end. The more I thought about it, the slower time seemed to move. I remember staring up at the night sky, waiting for the moon to come into view. It never did. Anya told me she would wake me up before going to sleep, so we could take turns keeping watch. It didn't do much good though. I was just as awake as she was. I got about an hour's worth of sleep. All in all, Anya didn't get anything. She didn't even bother to set up her tent. When I finally got up, it was still dark out. I checked my wristwatch, but it had stopped just before midnight. Anya was still up, staring into the cinders of the campfire. We had plenty of firewood, but she just couldn't be bothered to put them on. I got up my hammock and stretched. It's been more than a couple of weeks, said Anya. Time stopped making sense long ago. What was the last date you remember? Late July, I think. That's not too bad, I smiled. Just a couple of weeks out. I dug out the remaining salami from my pack and cut me a slice. I sat down across from her, at the other end of the campfire. I put a log on and watched the fire crackle back to life. Then, something whispered in the back of my mind, an obvious question that I hadn't considered. Up until now, it had been too absurd to ask. What year? Anya and I locked eyes. I could see a stark realization boiling in the back of her mind. I repeated the question. What year, Anya? Who's the president? She didn't respond. Something cold crawled up my spine as a thought settled. I didn't know who the hell was sitting across from me, or what they'd really seen, where we were even going. We should pack up, she said, breaking the tension. It's still dark out. Sometimes it stays that way for a while. As Anya packed up, I felt deflated. She was holding something back. And if we were to make it out, in any capacity, we needed to work together, follow the buddy system. Anya, you're not making any sense. Sometimes it stays dark. She breaks the rules to keep us here. What are you talking about? I've been here for so long that I don't know what's real anymore. I thought I could trick myself into forgetting, but she won't let me. She's there. She's always there. I didn't say anything. Anya kept pacing back and forth, scratching the back of her head. I wrote the damn sign, she growled. Because when you stop, she's there. When you listen, you hear her. When you look, Anya grabbed my shoulder and turned me around. When you look, there she is. At first, I didn't see anything. Maybe I didn't want to. But there was that gnawing doubt in the back of my mind. Something in my reptile brain telling me I was looking for something. Slowly, the shadows twisted. They bent out of shape, forming something new. With every blink of my eye, a picture created itself in the distance. A vague silhouette of a bone-thin woman. A few tufts of hair clinging to a decrepit scalp. A broken jaw hanging loose like a thread, swaying back and forth with a sudden breeze. A sour smell wafted my way, coating my tongue with the spike of ammonia. And of course, there it was, her signature blue dress, assuring to one and all that there could be no mistake. Lady Bluebell. Anya, what is? I looked back, only to see Anya backing away. She was packed and ready to go. She'd taken my canteen, and I could see my pack lying next to the campfire, wide open. There was a palpable fear in her eyes, like a wild animal. I can't let her take me, Anya wheezed. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Before I got the chance to process what she'd done, a sound cut through the forest breeze. Bells. So many bells. I turned to see the broken woman towering over me. She was much taller than expected. My legs buckled as I looked up at no less than a 9-foot-tall monstrosity. Her torn blue dress was lined with bells that chimed against every branch and root she passed over. She wasn't going to let me leave. She refused to be forgotten. I shouldn't have stopped, or listened, or looked. I stepped back, and she stepped forward. Her feet barely touched the ground, floating inches above the moss. Her ivory eyes burrowed into me, shrieking with desperation. She wouldn't let me go home. She couldn't. I turned to flee. I ran and jumped and crawled and forced myself past every obstacle. I snagged my foot on fallen rocks. I tumbled down a sudden slope, dropping half my gear. I stepped through a shallow mire, drenching myself in cold water all the way up to my knees. I bloodied my hands and feet and face, but I kept going. And somewhere along the way, the sun rose, wheezing for air. I realized I couldn't hear the bells anymore, but the moment I stopped to listen for them, I heard one. "No," I yelled out. "No, no, no. Stop thinking." I bit down on my thumb and screamed. I shouldn't listen. I shouldn't stop either. I had to keep going. It all reminded me of what my teachers had said years ago. How the world changes when we observe it. Maybe if it wasn't for people coming to listen and look, there would be nothing to see here. Maybe by keeping people around, a part of her collective self remains. I don't know how long I was out there. At least a couple of days. I kept moving, stopping only for short bursts of rest. Sometimes I'd dream of bells, and I'd wake to hear them. The slightest thought of Lady Bluebell drew her to me, like a moth to an open flame. I'd hear the bells long before I saw her, but one would always accompany the other. She was always there, a stray thought away. I survived by eating boiled pine cones, roots, and eggs from a bird's nest. I tried to track my progress, but there was no way to navigate. I'd either end up where I came from, or going in the wrong direction. I saw that same sign, in that same clearing, at least a dozen times. Don't stop, don't listen, don't look. My feet chafed, and I grew a solid beer stubble. Having barely slept, I was having trouble shaping cohesive thoughts. I remember sitting by a stream, not knowing how I got there. Maybe the same stream I'd seen the first day I met Anya. I was wringing out my socks and trying my best to ignore my shivering hands. I felt so weak that I couldn't remember what strength felt like. Just getting back on my feet felt like such a monolithic task that I couldn't force myself to do it. I resigned to sitting there with one naked foot in the icy cold water. My skin color faded as my blood cooled from a painful purple to a sickly blue. It took me a few minutes to realize I wasn't alone, but it wasn't Lady Bluebell. It was Anya, just across the stream. She looked at me with this air of pity, apologetic even. It took me a few seconds to notice the makeshift spear she'd whittled, using the Swiss Army knife from my pack, no doubt. "I really am sorry," she said. "After she feeds, she calms down. When she's calm, you can get out. I had to bring someone new in. The others are too fast, too clever." I didn't care. I couldn't bring myself to curse or scream. I just hated Anya and what she turned me into. I kept my eyes on the stream, watching the water turn my foot a new tint of blue. "Just take a nap," she said. "Lean back and let it happen. No fuss, no drama." I barely listened. All I could think of was that tinge of blue forming at the edge of my toe. It made me think of her. It made me think of bells. It made me look for her. "That's it," said Anya, readying her spear. "I'll just give you a little tap to make sure we won't have any problems." I looked down at my hands, covered in scabs and bruises, my wet socks clinging to my thighs. Suddenly, a pain shot through my left leg. A quick jab from her spear and my body exploded with damaged nerves. It was as if a burst of electricity shot through me, forcing me out of my lethargy. As my blood mixed with the stream, I could feel my heart beating out of my chest. I crawled backwards, unable to put any weight on my leg. Anya backed away, staying just close enough to make sure Lady Bluebell was properly fed, and the lady was already there. Maybe I had listened too long, or looked too hard. Maybe it was just the blue tint of my toe. Whatever it was, my thoughts had drawn her to me, and this time, I couldn't run. I heard the bells dragging my way, and saw a long shadow cover the ground. I looked back for a moment, catching a glimpse of her dead eyes coming my way. Lady Bluebell didn't take you home anymore. I couldn't run, but I had to try something. Anything. I tied my wet socks together into a makeshift blindfold and put it on as tight as I could. I pushed my wet fingers into my ears and screamed. I figured that if I couldn't listen or look, maybe she would be less interested in feeding on me. I focused on my pain in my leg as hard as I could, letting it envelop my thoughts. I knew she was closing in. My pulse went haywire, begging me to panic, to look back, to listen for threats, and to run. I know what to expect and prepare myself, but I didn't. There was a soft touch of cloth against my head. Little pieces of metal bells dragged across my body as Lady Bluebell passed me by. She didn't care for someone who couldn't look or listen, but Anya could. Anya did. Keeping the sock blindfold on, I flopped onto my belly. I kept my fingers in my ears, screaming until my throat was raw. I felt a thumping in the ground as something was dropped, and quick footsteps in rapid succession. Someone was running. Then, a sudden stop. For what felt like an eternity, it was just me and my thoughts. Maybe she got away. Maybe we both made it. Then, something meaty bumped into me. Something warm and wet. It splattered onto my clothes and stained my face, drowning the air with the stench of blood. There was a reverb in the air, like the vibration of a scream. But I didn't turn to look. I didn't turn to listen. And I refused to stop. Hours later, I made myself a crutch. I pressed wet moss into my ears and kept the blindfold tight. Blind and deaf, I forced my way forward. It was just inches at a time, and every step of the way shot through me like a bolt of lightning. And somewhere along the way, I felt a solid trail under my feet. Taking off the blindfold, I started to notice familiar landmarks. My clock started ticking, and my radio burst to life. I was back on familiar ground. Maybe Anya had been right. Lady Bluebell was more relaxed after feeding. Civilization was just around the corner, waiting for me to observe it once again. I'd been gone for 6 weeks. It was none other than Ranger Dan that came across me, leading a troop of junior rangers across the same trail as all those years ago. And yes, he had hot dogs. Now that some time has passed, and my leg has healed, I've retreated to an administration position. I keep my exposure to the park minimal. I haven't told anyone about what really happened, not only because it sounds completely insane, but because knowing about it might actually put them in danger. I might not get along with everyone, but I wouldn't wish for anyone to come looking for Lady Bluebell. Anya Baker was, indeed, reported missing from a company retreat. About 8 years prior, the strange young man was a mystery. No one matching his description had been seen for years. Looking back at it, it feels obvious. Anya had been so frantically preoccupied with fighting her way forward that she never really considered the first rule, to just stop. Perhaps there is some greater lesson to be learned. There were so many of us that never wanted Lady Bluebell to leave. We stopped along the trails to listen and look, hoping some part of her was still out there. Maybe we were just looking for our childhoods. I know I was. I believed that she was some collective consciousness of belief, remaining in a forgotten part of what the park used to look like. A creature we made and abandoned, like the ghost of someone who never truly was. Maybe the world changes when we look at it, and sometimes it changes when we don't. And in the deep dark of those unseen chasms, things still grow, unheard, unseen, and unstoppable. Back in April of 2013, I went through something that I haven't been able to talk about. I was paid a significant amount of money to stay quiet, in return for signing a 10-year agreement to shut the hell up. Now that the time is up, I've considered my options. I could just let this go and never speak of it again. I won't gain anything from speaking out, and I got a lot to lose. But then again, This is just an anonymous post online. Words have less meaning that way. West Virginia. It was hotter than usual, without a whiff of wind. I was coming home from a visit to my aunt. She'd broken her leg and couldn't leave her house. I was making my way back home, taking the I-65 out of Lewisburg. It started with the radio. It was playing that one Macklemore song I'd heard 100 times over. The sound was cutting in and out in quick succession, then disappeared completely. I could hear cars hunking up front as the line began to form. There was a sway in the trees, as if a greater and greater pressure was being put on them. I could hear wind rushing against the left side of the car, forcing me to pull the other way to compensate. I closed the sunroof as a dust cloud blew past, staining the windshield. Then, a rumble. It sounded like thunder, but from the ground, like a groaning bellow, growing louder and clearer by the second as it reached its peak. I could see the trees toppling over. A small Kia got pushed off balance and swerved off the road. As the sound died down, the road devolved into chaos. Some were desperately changing lanes. Others were stepping on the brakes. I got my door scraped as the car behind me sped past. The radio was playing an automated message, a local emergency alert, referred to as a geological event. We were asked to turn off all air conditioning, slow down, and divert to the nearest exit. It repeated in a monotone voice. Geological event, no air conditioning, slow down, divert to nearest exit. Minutes passed. There was a line forming further down the road. Police officers blocking the lanes in all directions, leaving a highway exit as the only option. Some folks were trying to push past the barricades, but were forced back at gunpoint. I could see officers wearing gas masks and riot shields. We were waved in. I followed the exit and got directed to the right. There was an open field that was used as a sort of impromptu parking lot. Cars were being waved in and parked in a way that boxed us in, leaving no room for us to open our doors in either direction unless we got parked at the edge. 4 lines of cars with about 10 to 15 vehicles per line. Surplus vehicles were directed further down the road. The place was packed. I got stuck in the second row, about 6 cars in. Pretty much everyone around me were on their phones. I didn't have anyone to call, but there seemed to be an issue getting a signal through. The radio was still repeating the emergency message. Voices were getting louder. A man 2 cars to my left leaned out of a gap in the door, screaming at the officers to answer his question. They responded immediately with a warning shot, straight into the air. "Stay in your vehicles," they screamed. "Lock your doors. I'm not telling you again." A couple of folks were filming, but there seemed to be trouble uploading. We were losing bandwidth. It didn't take long until phone signals were completely blocked. I think a video or 2 of the officer firing into the air made it online. They were patrolling back and forth. We were told to stay in our vehicles, windows up, doors closed and locked, engines off. I could hear people talking in the other cars. Someone said there had been a natural gas leak from the geological event, and that the combustible engines could spark an explosion. Others were talking about a terrorist attack. There were no answers, and the officers weren't eager to talk. After about an hour, things were getting ugly. People were hungry, thirsty, and restless. One officer stepped up on the front cars, handing out water bottles, crackers, and processed cheese slices. He had to step back from one car to another, denting the hoods with his steel-tipped boots. They were also handing out thick black plastic hygiene bags for people who needed to relieve themselves. "Use them, seal them, drop them out the door, then lock up and wait." I'd crawled into the back seat, pulled down my cap, and tried to relax. I'd been playing some games on my phone, but the battery was running low. I wanted to save some, so I settled for having a nap instead. The sweat was stinging my eyes, not because of how warm it was, but because how nervous I was. No matter what I did, I felt trapped, and the car felt smaller and smaller. I couldn't get out if I wanted to, and it physically hurt me to think about how little control I had. Is that what claustrophobia feels like? A couple of officers were discussing something by the front line. One of them had a white cotton glove on, which was used to wipe off the hood of one of the front cars. The glove was taken off and put into a bag, which in turn was sealed with a hot air gun. I was getting the impression that our cars had been covered in something. I wasn't the only one considering it. There were 2 college kids in the car to my left, and they were discussing it too. Anthrax? One of them said. It's gotta be. Nah, gold dust, the other chuckled. They don't want to share. You know what? The first one groaned. I honest to God hope you're right. You're not, but I hope you are. Fuck you. I joined in the conversation shortly after. I offered another explanation. Something combustible. Something that might blow up if we started our cars. They were willing to consider this. The car behind me couldn't hear us, but the driver held up a notebook with the text. If we don't know what it is, it's gotta be aliens. I couldn't tell if they were serious, but they weren't laughing about it. A man in his 50s and what looked like his daughter. There were a couple of other folks in the other cars. A man in a black shirt, sort of looked like a preacher without a collar. 2 middle-aged women with a kid in the back seat. A fat man blaring Johnny Cash from his stereo. A couple with a teenage son who couldn't stop drumming on the windows. We'd been stuck for about 2, maybe 2.5 hours, when a truck rolled in. One of those with a large water tank. It was unmarked, looked civilian. As it rolled in, they were calling out on the megaphone. We'll be hosing your vehicles down, they said. Keep everything locked and closed. Then we'll be covering your vehicle with a protective plastic while we wait for it to dry. After that, we'll start letting you go in an orderly manner. I repeat, most of us were relieved. It was only a matter of time now. It was getting dark. They were getting up on the cars, hosing them down thoroughly. It smelled like chlorine, so maybe they'd mixed something into the water. As they came to my car, they stepped up on it and double-checked the sunroof, making sure it was locked and secured. They sprayed the car down, bathing it in chemical stink, the kind that gets stuck in the back of your throat. It took a long time for them to finish, at least an hour or 2. After that, they were rolling out a kind of plastic cover at the short side of the lot, the kind you use to protect pools or rain covers for football fields. They used 2 squad cars to slowly drape the thing over the entire lot, securing the edges with large rocks. Please stay calm, they called out as the plastic crawled over us. I know this is uncomfortable, but this is for your own safety. Once the cleaning is done, you will be free to go. Stay inside your vehicle at all times. I repeat. I did as I was told. I stayed inside, and I watched that plastic cover sweep over me. It felt like getting buried alive. All the lights went out, leaving me in complete darkness, accompanied only by the vague disembodied voices of the others. The college kids were talking about where they were going to go after this. Someone was honking, not sure if it was to show support or discontent. Someone else was cheering. I took my last swig of water, washing down my final plain cracker. I got back in the driver's seat. I could hear as they finished moving the plastic cover and parking their squad vehicles. I patiently waited, figuring it would be maybe another hour or so. They hadn't really given us a timeline, but I could breathe a little easier. Sort of. I was going back and forth between feeling empowered with my hands on the wheel and feeling like I was stuck in a metal coffin. It was so dark, and everything smelt of plastic and chemicals, like a car wash stuck in time. As the excitement died down, I paid more attention to the background sounds. I tried to filter out the various discussions from the nearby cars, and somewhere in the distance, I heard raised vocals. It wasn't coming from the cars, but the officers. Whatever they were talking about, it was a heated discussion. An hour came and went, and people were getting impatient. More cars were honking, others were yelling, demanding answers. I couldn't get my leg to stop shaking. The more I thought about getting out of there, the smaller the car felt. I was hyper-focusing on things I couldn't control. I was a little thirsty, and I was out of water. I needed to use the bathroom. I wanted to stretch my legs and go for a walk. I wanted to breathe fresh air and get that awful chemical taste out of my mouth. I heard cars starting, accelerating. The truck was moving, somewhere off to the side. "We need you to stay in your vehicle," a voice screamed over the megaphone. "Do not leave for any reason. Stay in your vehicle." Cars speeding off. Not many, but a couple. Then, quiet. The officers left us there. Everyone was quiet. A couple of folks had opened up their phones, using them as flashlights to look from car to car, looking out at the sea of vehicles. All of us were trapped under that dark cover. I could see a handful of lights cut off by sharp silhouettes. I couldn't make out who was in the dark. It was all just people. Anonymous. I heard a gasp somewhere in the back. There was a metallic clunk, like when the officers climbed on top of our cars to get us water. There was a careful cheer as some folks figured they were taking off the plastic cover. But that wasn't it. Instead, there were more footsteps. The cheers slowly died down as more and more footsteps pattered across our cars. I stopped counting after a dozen. The silhouettes in the other cars were still. We all held our breaths, waiting for an answer to show itself. What the hell was going on? What was that sound? Somewhere off to my right, I heard a voice. "Who's up there?" It sounded like an older man. I'd seen a pickup truck that way earlier. Almost as a response, the footsteps stopped. There was a faint clicking sound, like someone snapping their tongue against the roof of their mouth. Click, click. And from further away, a click in response. From somewhere to my left, another couple clicks. Then, a cascade of clicks. Dozens, maybe hundreds. There was an awful metallic noise coming from my right. Then, breaking glass. A scream cut short, followed by several irregular taps of the car horn. One of the silhouettes in the distance turned into a blur as something passed through the windshield, cutting through the plastic cover. Somewhere in the front row, the roof of the car was cut wide open. Someone was pulled up out of their seat. 2 cars back from where I was, there was more glass breaking. It sounded like a wild animal got in. I could see a weak hint of red splattered against the passenger side windows. I wasn't getting any air. I could feel my heart beating through my chest as my arms started shaking. My hands were cramped around the steering wheel, and I felt sweat dripping down my shoulders. I couldn't control it. I didn't even see what was going on. But these sounds, these screams, they awakened something primal. This was danger, a threat. My body knew it long before I did. The college kids in the other car were ducking down. One of them waved a hand at me, as if telling me to get down. I nodded. I scrambled into the back seat. I couldn't see where I was putting my hands or feet. Everything is different in the dark. As I stumbled my way over, my foot accidentally tapped the car horn. It was a quick tap, a fraction of a second, but to me, it was the loudest sound in the world. I was lying on my stomach in the back seat, and within seconds, something heavy climbed onto the hood of my car. I could feel the car buckling. It was much heavier than the man who'd passed out water bottles. I held my hands in front of my mouth to stop the panting, but I just ended up snorting up sweat instead. My nose stung as I bit my tongue, listening to every metallic groan as whatever was outside moved and shifted. Click, click, and from behind my car, a click in response. There were no lights being held up anymore. Everyone was cowering, going quiet. I pushed myself up against the door behind the driver's seat, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear the frame of the car complain as something slowly moved. When it came to my sunroof, there was a light crack. That made it stop. Another crack. I silently shook my head, as if trying to ask the car to stop. That thing was going to break, and it did. My legs were showered with glass as the big blob of plastic covering dipped into my car. Something big came tumbling into my front seat, still covered in protective plastic. It twitched and spun around, its clicking turning from a careful question-like noise to a never-ending barrage. It was calling for help, alerting others, and it was cutting its way through the plastic. There were footsteps coming from every direction, some of them leaping from car to car, some of them leaping far enough to skip a car as they hurried. I was going to be swarmed within seconds. I fumbled with my hands, accidentally cutting my thumb on the broken glass. I managed to open the passenger side door, but even at its widest, and even when pressing into the college kid's car, it wasn't enough room to get out. Still, I had to try. I pressed myself into the gap and exhaled as much as I could, flattening my chest. While the thing thrashed around inside my car, I could feel my vision going faint. Black spots popped up at the edge of my vision. My arms were going weak. And yet, by some miracle, I made it through. As my face hit the gravel on the makeshift parking lot, I felt the burn of residual chemicals. I swallowed my instinct to run, instead, staying on my stomach, forcing myself to crawl under my car. There were more of them, some climbing on, some off. My chest was pressed to the ground as the weight shifted. I heard breaking glass from the windshield and tearing fabric. Something was stuck up there, and it was furious, like a trapped animal. I could hear the college kids mumbling to one another, trying to stay calm, one assuring the other that all they had to do was stay low, stay quiet, and wait. Then, something slammed into the passenger side door, the one I'd crawled out of. The door was pressed up against the neighbor's car, then fell haphazardly onto the ground, completely off the hinges. An ink-black bird-like foot stepped on the ground next to me. I've looked it up since. There were 3 toes forward, 1 toe backward, and clawed. Anisodactyl feet, similar to that of many birds of prey, except larger than a human foot, and with smooth, oil-slick skin. It must have been heavy, at least 400 pounds. If the clicking noises came from its mouth, I can approximate that it was somewhere between 6'7" to 6'9", or taller. It could have been hunched over. How it managed to walk in the gap between the vehicles is beyond me, but I suspect it was very thin. It daintily walked from my car to the others, as if scanning for something. I could barely see anything in the dark, but this thing seemed to navigate it perfectly. It didn't bump into anything. There was a tap on the glass of the car behind me, to my right, and someone got startled. A short scream, and the hunt was on. This time was different. It must have caused some kind of chain reaction, as all of a sudden, the plastic cover was getting torn up left and right. People were clawing their way out of their cars. I heard someone kicking against their windshield. Another was trying to open their door. I could hear it slamming against the other side of the car next to them. And off in the distance, there was gunfire. Just a couple of shots. The college kids in the car next to me slammed their doors open and followed my lead. They rolled onto the ground and under their car. There was a little more light coming in as the cover had been torn above. Their faces were red from tears, and one of them was desperately trying to call for help on his phone. The other grabbed the phone out of his hand. A short scuffle ensued, ending with them putting on the ringtone and sliding the thing as far left as they could. Whatever car that phone landed under was demolished, every window broken, every passenger gone. I could hear the grinding as a seat was ripped in two and thrown away. In a matter of seconds, an entire vehicle was torn to pieces, as dozens of those things swarmed it. "Shut up," one of the college kids repeated. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." Something reached under my car. It scraped against the sole of my shoe, tearing a hole all the way through my big toe. I hurried forward, scurrying like a lizard. The college kids noticed and followed suit. I don't think they thought about it too much. It was just movement, and they went with it. I made it 2 cars down before I got stuck. There was something dark in the way, and I couldn't get around it without exposing myself. I couldn't see what it was, but it didn't take long for me to figure it out. There was a meaty crunch, as if someone was biting chunks out of a piece of meat. It was struggling to get through the fabric of their clothes, making a snapping noise as threads gave way. A pool of blood rolled under the car, staining the tip of my fingers. It was still warm. One of those things were eating a victim. I hunkered down, trying to remember to breathe, and I stayed there, waiting for a chance. Any chance. I must have stayed there for at least an hour, hearing every bite, every crack of bone and snap of sinew, satisfied clicking noises. As it finished its meal, it wandered off, dragging the remains along. They were moving forward. Something heavy walked over the car I was hiding under, dragging a body behind. Slowly, the footsteps disappeared. It was quiet again, and in all that, I found my footing. I made my way to the edge of the plastic cover. I listened one final time, pushing one of the weights away, and slipped through. They were gone, and I was out. I could feel my chest growing lighter, allowing me to breathe. I wanted to cry from relief. A breeze was picking up, drying the sweat on my brow and carrying the smell of grass. Stepping back, I turned towards the sea of cars to see how bad the damage was, and then I saw one. It was bit low off to the side, perching atop an old Honda. At a glance, it looked like a tall person, covered in a slick black ink. But looking closer, you could see the strange bird-like feet, the pointed nails, the long row of shark-like teeth on a mouth that was far too wide. I froze. The thing rose to its full length, easily over 7 feet tall. It looked ready to pounce on me. I had nothing to defend myself with. I couldn't make any sudden moves. I wouldn't even be halfway under the car before that thing would be over me. 100 thoughts raced through my mind, but there was nothing I could do. I was out of options, but the thing just looked at me. It raised a slice of raw meat. Blood dripped onto the plastic cover. It looked at me curiously, taking a bite. Then, as if nothing had happened, it wandered off. Satiated, I was left there, shaking like a dry leaf, and with the last one of those things gone, all that was left was the panic. It didn't take long for the officers to return. The plastic cover was removed, but we couldn't go home. Not after this. Some folks signed a waiver and were let go immediately. They weren't allowed to talk about what they'd seen, and in return, they'd get a hefty sum of insurance money. Others demanded answers, and were taken into custody for obstruction of justice. A few others still were too panicked to make any kind of sense, and had to be checked out by a medical personnel. A total of 14 people died. It was described by a combination of causes: a traffic pileup, carbon monoxide poisoning, animal attack. I think there was something about an escaped convict too. Excuses all over the place, and the times were all wrong, spread out through a couple of days to more smoothly blend into accident statistics. And if you wanted to go home and get your insurance money, you had to sign a non-disclosure. I did too. I knew the college kids did as well. Goddamn miracle they made it out. But I saw them. 34 cars had to be towed, 18 people wounded, 6 seriously so. 4 people lost at least one limb. One guy had an arm ripped halfway up his collarbone. I don't know how he survived. Most people never saw those things up close. They just remember the screams and the breaking glass. Sometimes at night, that's all I hear too. Closing my eyes reminds me of lying under those cars, feeling the pressure as the weight shifted. I still get trouble breathing. I think part of me is still stuck there. It stayed in my vehicle.